Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time to colonial Boston, somewhere around the early to mid-1700s, and you're going to live it. Not as a tourist with a laminated map and a gift shop waiting at the exit, but as an actual resident of this gritty, smoky, surprisingly small town, clinging to the edge of a continent that most Europeans still consider a howling wilderness. Picture yourself right now, lying in a bed that creaks with every breath, stuffed with straw that pokes through the linen in a room so dark you cannot see your own hand. The air smells of wood smoke, tallow, and something vaguely sour that you've learned to stop questioning. Outside, a pig is snorting through someone's garbage. Welcome to Boston. You probably won't survive this. Statistically speaking, between smallpox, house fires, and the astonishing lack of anything resembling hygiene, your odds are not spectacular. But isn't that part of the charm? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and your local time in the comments, whether you're winding down in Tokyo at 2 in the morning or settling in somewhere in Ohio with the crickets outside. Let's see how far this cozy little history session reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, and for a moment you have no idea what time it is. There's no glowing clock on a nightstand, no phone screen to blind you with notifications. There is only darkness, thick and absolute, and the faint suggestion of grey light beginning to creep around the edges of the wooden shutters. Somewhere across town, a church bell begins to toll, and the sound rolls through the cold air like a summons you cannot ignore. This is how nearly every day of your life begins in colonial Boston. Not with an alarm you can snooze, but with the slow, reluctant acknowledgement that the world outside your bed is waiting, and it is unforgiving. You push back the heavy woolen blanket that has kept you from freezing overnight. The room is cold, genuinely cold, the kind of cold that makes your joints ache the moment you move. The fire in the hearth downstairs burned down to embers hours ago, and nobody has risen yet to coax it back to life. Your breath fogs in front of your face as you swing your legs over the side of the bed, and your bare feet touch the floorboards. The shock of it travels straight up your spine. These planks are made of wide pine, hand-hewn and full of splinters, and in winter they feel like slabs of ice. You've learned to keep a pair of worn leather shoes beside the bed for this exact reason, though some mornings you forget. The room you sleep in is small, perhaps 8 feet by 10, with a ceiling so low that a tall man would need to duck near the edges where the roof slopes down. The walls are plain plaster over wooden lath, unpainted, slightly damp in the corners where moisture seeps through. There is no closet. Closets as we imagine them are a luxury of later centuries. Instead, your few garments hang from pegs driven into the wall, and a single wooden chest at the foot of the bed holds everything else you own in this world. A cracked mirror, a comb with missing teeth, a Bible that belonged to your grandmother, a handkerchief embroidered by someone you try not to think about too often. This is your entire universe of personal possessions. If you are lucky, you sleep alone in this room, but luck is a relative concept in colonial Boston. More likely, you share this space with a sibling, a fellow apprentice, or even a stranger, a boarder who pays a few shillings a week for the privilege of a spot in your bed. Yes, your actual bed. The concept of personal sleeping space is a modern indulgence that would strike most Bostonians as absurd, even wasteful. Beds are expensive. Warmth is precious. Bodies huddle together not out of affection, but out of pure thermodynamic necessity. Historians still argue whether this practice was entirely practical or also carried social bonding functions that we've lost in our age of private bedrooms and memory foam mattresses. You stand, stretching muscles that ache from yesterday's labour, whatever that labour might have been. Perhaps you spent 10 hours bent over a cobbler's bench, or hauling barrels on the waterfront, or scrubbing floors in a merchant's house until your knuckles cracked and bled. Colonial Boston does not believe in rest days the way you might imagine. There is the Sabbath, yes, but the Sabbath is for church, for prayer, for sitting in rigid silence while ministers thunder about your inevitable damnation. It is not for relaxation. It is certainly not for fun. Fun, as a concept, makes Puritans deeply suspicious. The house around you is beginning to stir. You hear footsteps on the stairs, the creak of a door, a child's cough muffled by a wall. These houses are not quiet places. They are made of wood frames, wood walls, wood floors, and every sound travels. You can hear your neighbour's argument through the wall, as clearly as if they were standing beside you. You know when the family upstairs is having a difficult night with their colicky infant. Privacy is another luxury that simply does not exist in the way you might expect. Your life is lived in public, in community, in the constant awareness that someone is always watching, always listening, always ready to report to the minister or the magistrate if you step out of line. You make your way down a narrow staircase, each step groaning under your weight. The stairs are steep, almost ladder-like, designed to save space in a house where every square foot matters. The ground floor opens into the main living area, the hall they call it, though it looks nothing like what that word conjures in modern minds. This is the heart of the home, a single room dominated by an enormous fireplace that serves for cooking, heating and light. The walls are lined with simple wooden shelves holding pewter plates, a few ceramic jugs, some wooden spoons. There is a long trestle table with benches on either side, a spinning wheel in the corner, and a clutter of daily life that speaks to how many activities happen in this one cramped space. Someone has already been awake for an hour or more. The fire is crackling now, fed with fresh logs, and an iron pot hangs over the flames, steam rising from whatever is simmering inside. The woman tending it, perhaps your mother, perhaps your master's wife, perhaps a servant whose name you barely know, does not look up as you enter. She has been awake since well before dawn, as she is every day, because the fire does not light itself and the household does not run on wishes. Her day began in darkness, and will not end until long after the sun sets. She has already fetched water from the well, already fed the chickens scratching in the small yard behind the house, already begun the endless process of preparing food for a family that seems perpetually hungry. You move toward the fire, holding your hands out to catch the warmth, feeling the numbness slowly recede from your fingers. The smell of wood smoke is so constant in colonial Boston that you've stopped noticing it, the way a fish presumably stops noticing water. It clings to your clothes, your hair, your skin. It seeps into the walls and the bedding and every object you own. Centuries from now, archaeologists will find traces of it in the very bones of people who lived like you, soot particles lodged deep in lung tissue. But you don't think about that. You think about the cold and the fire and the long day stretching ahead of you. Through the small window, real glass, a sign that this household has some means, you can see the first true light of morning beginning to spread across the sky. The window is made of many small panes held together with lead, wavy and imperfect, turning the world outside into a soft blur. But you can see enough. You can see the rooftops of neighbouring houses packed close together, separated by narrow alleys barely wide enough for a handcart. You can see smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, everyone in the neighbourhood performing the same morning ritual, coaxing warmth from the same stubborn flames. Boston in the early 1700s is home to perhaps 10 or 12,000 people, a number that sounds impossibly small to modern ears, but makes it one of the largest cities in British North America. It sits on a peninsula shaped roughly like a pear, connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land called the Neck, which floods at high tide and turns the whole town into something close to an island. The streets are not laid out in any logical grid. They twist and turn following old cowpaths and property lines that made sense to someone a century ago. Getting lost is remarkably easy, even for people who have lived here their whole lives. But right now, in this quiet moment before the day truly begins, none of that matters. Right now, there is only the warmth of the fire on your face, the smell of whatever is cooking in that iron pot, and the slow acceptance that another day in colonial Boston has begun. You did not ask for this life. Nobody asked you. You were simply born into it, or bound into it, or washed up on these shores by circumstances beyond your control. And now here you are, standing in a cramped wooden house, watching the grey light grow stronger through wavy glass, preparing to step out into a world that is harsh and demanding, and utterly indifferent to your comfort. You take a breath. The air tastes of smoke and salt and something indefinably old. And then you begin to move, because the day is waiting, and in colonial Boston the day does not wait for anyone. The clothes you must put on this morning are not merely fabric, they are a language. Every thread, every cut, every faded stain tells the people of Boston exactly who you are, what you do, and where you stand in the rigid hierarchy of colonial society. There is no slipping into a pair of jeans and a comfortable hoodie, no grabbing whatever is clean from the floor of your closet. Getting dressed in the 1700s is an act of social declaration, and getting it wrong can bring consequences you would rather not face. You start with your shift if you are a woman, or your shirt if you are a man. This is the foundation layer, the garment that touches your skin directly. Made of linen that has been washed so many times it has softened into something almost tolerable. Almost. The linen is still coarse compared to modern cotton, still scratchy in ways that would make you desperate for a tag-free t-shirt. But it absorbs sweat. It can be laundered when water and time allow, and it protects the more valuable outer garments from the oils and grime of your body. Because here's a fact that might unsettle you. Those outer garments are almost never washed. Wool, leather, silk. These things do not go into a basin of water. They are brushed, they are aired, they are spot cleaned with various mysterious concoctions, but they are not washed. The shift or shirt is the only thing between your skin and months, sometimes years, of accumulated wear. If you are a man of common status, and statistically you probably are, your next layer involves breeches. These are trousers that end just below the knee, fastened with buttons or ties, made of wool or perhaps sturdy linen depending on the season and your occupation. They fit close to the leg, which means putting them on is not a simple hop and pull situation. You work them up over your calves, fasten them at the waist with a full front rather than a modern fly, and then you deal with stockings. The stockings are important. They cover your lower legs from ankle to above the knee, made of knitted wool, or if you have money you probably don't have silk. They are held up by garters, strips of cloth or leather tied just below the knee, and they require adjustment throughout the day because they absolutely inevitably continuously slide down. Now comes the waistcoat, a sleeveless or sleeved vest that buttons up the front and provides warmth as well as decoration. The waistcoat is often the most colourful piece of clothing a man owns, a small rebellion against the drabness of everyday colonial life. Even modest Bostonians might sport a waistcoat in deep red or forest green, embroidered with simple patterns that catch the light. It sits beneath the coat, peeking out at the chest and the hem, and its condition tells observers much about your circumstances. A waistcoat with frayed edges and missing buttons says one thing. A waistcoat of fine wool with brass fastenings says quite another. The coat itself is a substantial garment, falling to mid-thigh or below, with deep cuffs that can be rolled back to keep them out of the way during work. It buttons in the front but is often worn open, displaying the waistcoat beneath. The whole ensemble creates a silhouette that looks strange to modern eyes. The emphasis on the torso, the tight legs, the lack of any garment resembling what we would call pants. But to the people of colonial Boston, this is simply how men dress. This is how men have always dressed, as far as living memory extends, and suggesting otherwise would mark you as a lunatic or a foreigner. For women, the process is considerably more complex, more time-consuming, and more physically demanding. If you wake as a woman in colonial Boston, your morning involves architecture as much as fabric. You begin with the shift, yes, that same linen foundation layer. But then come the stays. Stays are the precursor to the Victorian corset, though less dramatically hourglass-shaped and somewhat more forgiving in their construction. They are made of layers of linen or canvas, reinforced with channels of whalebone or, for those who cannot afford whalebone, bundled reeds or strips of wood. They lace up the back, which means you cannot put them on yourself without assistance, a fact that shapes social life in ways you might not immediately consider. Someone must help you dress every single morning. Someone must be present, awake, and willing to pull those laces tight. For wealthy women, this is a servant. For everyone else, it is a sister, a mother, a daughter, a friend. Dressing is inherently a communal activity. The stays do several things at once. They provide support for the bust, yes, but they also reshape the entire torso, pushing the shoulders back, straightening the spine, creating a posture that colonial society considers properly feminine. They restrict movement. You cannot bend at the waist easily, cannot twist and turn with casual abandon, cannot slump in a chair even if you wanted to. They force a certain comportment, a certain grace, a constant awareness of your body's position in space. Some historians argue that stays were instruments of patriarchal control, literally constraining women's bodies into shapes men found pleasing. Others point out that women themselves often praise the comfort and support well-fitted stays provided, that the garments were seen as essential rather than oppressive. The truth probably lies somewhere in the complicated middle, as truth usually does. Over the stays goes the petticoat, or rather, multiple petticoats. The word does not mean what it means in modern English. We're not talking about a slip worn under a skirt. A petticoat in colonial Boston is the skirt itself, a full-length garment tied at the waist. Women typically wear at least 2, sometimes 3 or more, layered over each other for warmth and shape. The outermost petticoat is the visible one, the one made of nicer fabric, the one that shows. The inner petticoats are practical, warming, hidden. This layering creates the full silhouette of a colonial woman, wide at the hips, sweeping to the floor, substantial and grounded in a way that contrasts with the modern preference for slim lines. A bodice or jacket goes over the stays, often lacing up the front or pinning closed, covering the chest and creating the complete upper body look. An apron protects the front of the petticoats from the inevitable splashes and stains of daily work, and aprons in this era are not the decorative strips of fabric we associate with 1950s housewives. Colonial aprons are serious, full-length working garments, often made of sturdy linen, covering nearly the entire front of the dress. And we haven't even discussed the head. Both men and women cover their heads in colonial Boston, though for different reasons. For women, a cap or coif is essential. Bare hair is considered immodest, almost scandalous, appropriate only for the bedroom. These caps are made of white linen, often with lace edges if you have any pretensions to gentility, and they tie under the chin or pin into place over hair that has been arranged beneath them. For outdoor wear, hats made of straw or felt go over the cap, providing protection from sun and rain. For men, hats are equally essential, though the style carries different meanings. A 3-cornered cocked hat announces a man of some standing. A simple wool cap suggests a labourer, a sailor, someone who works with their hands. Going bareheaded is unusual, almost rude, a breach of social expectation that invites comment. The colour of your clothing matters enormously. Sumptuary laws, though increasingly unenforced by the 1700s, once dictated exactly what colours and fabrics different social classes could wear. The echoes of these regulations still linger in custom and expectation. Bright colours, elaborate embroidery, fine silks. These belong to merchants, to magistrates, to ministers and their wives. The labouring classes wear homespun wool and linen in shades of brown, grey tan, and that particular colonial colour called butternut, a yellowish brown achieved through dyeing with walnut hulls. To dress above your station is to invite mockery at best, formal punishment at worst. And everything takes time. Getting dressed in the morning is not a 5-minute affair. It is a process that can consume 20 minutes, 30 minutes, longer if the stays are stubborn, or the laces have tangled overnight. It requires help, requires light, requires a fire warm enough that you don't shiver uncontrollably while half-clothed. This is why many colonists simply slept in portions of their clothing, why the shift and shirt served as nightwear as much as undergarments. The idea of dedicated pyjamas of clothing meant only for sleeping would seem frivolously impractical. There is something almost ritualistic about it, this morning transformation from the vulnerable creature of sleep into the social being of day. You're not just covering your body against cold, you're armouring yourself against the judging eyes of neighbours, constructing a version of yourself that fits the narrow, acceptable parameters of colonial society. And as you fasten that final button, as you adjust that cap to sit just so, you understand something that modern people sometimes forget. Clothing is never neutral. Clothing is always saying something. In colonial Boston, it says everything. Your stomach growls as you descend those steep stairs, but breakfast as you imagine it, a spread of eggs and bacon, fresh orange juice catching the morning light, toast with butter melting into golden puddles, simply does not exist in colonial Boston. The very concept of a dedicated morning meal, carefully prepared and ceremoniously consumed, belongs to a future that hasn't arrived yet. What you get instead is whatever happens to be available, and what happens to be available is usually not much. The table holds a wooden bowl containing leftover hasty pudding from last night's supper. Hasty pudding is exactly what it sounds like. A mush made from cornmeal boiled in water or milk, cooked quickly, served without ceremony. It has cooled overnight into something between porridge and concrete, and you eat it cold because reheating would require time and fuel that cannot be spared. You add a splash of molasses if the household can afford such luxuries, and you eat with a wooden spoon, scooping the bland, grainy mass into your mouth and trying not to think too hard about what you're tasting. There might be bread if someone baked recently. Bread in colonial Boston is not the soft, sliced, uniformly rectangular product of industrial bakeries. It is dense, coarse, made from whatever flour is available, often a mixture of wheat and rye, sometimes cornmeal added to stretch the wheat further. It goes stale within days and is eaten anyway, perhaps soaked in liquid to make it chewable, perhaps just gnawed through sheer determination. Butter exists, made at home from cream skim from milk, but it is a laborious product that takes time to churn and must be used before it goes rancid. Not every household has butter on a given Tuesday morning. And then there is the drink. You wash down your meagre breakfast with small beer. Not coffee, not tea, not the fresh milk you might imagine children drinking from tall glasses. Small beer is everywhere in colonial Boston, consumed by adults and children alike, present at every meal and many moments between. It is a low-alcohol beverage, perhaps 2 or 3%, brewed at home from malt, water, and whatever flavouring agents are handy. The alcohol content is just enough to kill the bacteria that make plain water dangerous to drink. Because water in 1700s Boston is genuinely dangerous, drawn from wells that may be contaminated by nearby privies, carried in buckets that harbour who knows what, stored in barrels that breed invisible threats. People who drink plain water get sick. People who drink small beer generally do not. This is why even toddlers are given beer. This is why the idea of starting your day with a glass of water would strike colonists as bizarre, even reckless. The taste of small beer is thin, slightly sour, vaguely grainy. It bears little resemblance to modern craft ales or even mass-market lagers. It is not something you drink for pleasure exactly. It is something you drink because you must, because thirst is constant and alternatives are few. Cider serves a similar function. Hard cider, fermented from apples, another low-alcohol daily beverage that fills the role water plays in modern life. Historians estimate that the average colonial adult consumed somewhere between 3 and 6 pints of alcoholic beverages daily. This sounds astonishing until you understand the water situation. This sounds like alcoholism until you realise the alcohol content was low enough that constant intoxication was rare. People were not stumbling through colonial Boston in a perpetual drunken haze. They were simply hydrating in the only way that didn't court disease. Breakfast is quick. There is no lingering over the table, no leisurely reading of newspapers that barely exist yet, no scrolling through morning feeds. You eat, you drink, you stand, you prepare to leave. The whole affair takes perhaps 10 minutes, 15 if the hasty pudding is particularly stubborn, and then the day truly begins, because there is work to do, and work in colonial Boston waits for no one's digestion. But let us pause for a moment on food itself, because what colonists ate differed so dramatically from modern expectations that it deserves attention. The diet of 1700s. Boston was seasonal in ways that modern refrigeration has completely erased from our experience. In summer and early fall, fresh vegetables might appear. Cabbages, onions, turnips, beans, peas, the produce of kitchen gardens that most households maintained. But these fresh items lasted only as long as the season allowed. There were no greenhouses pumping out tomatoes in January, no trucks bringing strawberries from California, no frozen vegetable aisle offering year-round variety. Winter meant preservation. Salted meat, smoked fish, pickled vegetables, dried beans, root vegetables stored in cellars where the cool earth kept them from rotting. This was the winter larder. And salt was the key to all of it. That precious mineral that made long-term storage possible. Beef packed in barrels of brine, pork preserved as ham or bacon, codfish dried until stiff as boards and soaked back to edibility months later. The flavours were intense, heavily salted, monotonous in their repetition. You might eat salted pork with cabbage for supper 3 nights a week, 4 nights a week, variations so minor they barely registered as change. There is a quirky detail that illuminates colonial eating habits. The one-pot meal was not merely convenient but practically universal. The iron pot hanging over the fire was often never emptied, never fully cleaned. Ingredients were added as they became available, a chunk of meat here, some vegetables there, bones for broth simmered until they fell apart. The pot perpetually bubbled, perpetually evolved, creating stews and pottages that had no fixed recipe, no beginning and no end. Monday's beef became Tuesday's beef and turnip, became Wednesday's beef and turnip and bean. each day adding to and subtracting from the communal pot. It sounds unhygienic by modern standards, and perhaps it was. But constant heat killed most bacteria, and the alternative, individual meals cooked fresh each time, was simply impractical given the labour and fuel involved. Meat was eaten more frequently than you might expect, at least by Boston standards. The town was a port surrounded by waters teeming with fish, connected to a hinterland where farms raised cattle, pigs, and sheep. This was not the vegetable-heavy peasant diet of European villages. Colonists ate meat when they could get it, which was often, but the cuts were not the tender steaks and chops of modern preference. They were the tough, muscular portions that required hours of slow cooking to become tender. Shoulders, shanks, briskets, the parts that modern butchers sometimes struggle to sell. Roasting was reserved for special occasions and wealthy households. For most Bostonians, meat meant boiled, stewed, or smoked. Fish played an enormous role, particularly cod. The waters off New England produced cod in quantities that seemed almost inexhaustible, a bounty that had drawn European fishing fleets long before permanent settlement. Dried salt cod became one of Boston's primary exports, shipped to Catholic Europe where meatless Fridays created constant demand. But plenty remained for local consumption, and cod appeared on Boston tables with regularity. Baked, boiled, made into fish cakes, stirred into chowders that were just beginning to develop their regional identity. Fruits and sweets occupy a complicated place in the colonial diet. Sugar existed but was expensive, imported from Caribbean plantations, available mainly to those with means. Ordinary Bostonians sweetened their foods with molasses, a cheaper byproduct of sugar production that flowed into the port in enormous quantities. Molasses went into baked goods, into puddings, into that morning hasty pudding, into rum distilled at local operations. It gave colonial cooking a particular flavour profile, dark, rich, slightly bitter, that differed markedly from the refined white sugar sweetness we take for granted. Fresh fruit was seasonal, fleeting, eaten with enthusiasm when available and mourned when gone. Apples dominated because apple trees thrived in New England, and the fruit could be stored in cool cellars for months. Dried apples extended the season further. Apple cider, apple butter, apple pie. The fruit inserted itself into colonial cuisine in every possible form. Other fruits appeared briefly, berries in summer, pears in fall. But the year-round fruit availability of modern supermarkets remained centuries away. Historians still argue whether the colonial diet was healthy by modern standards. On one hand, it was heavy with salt, lacking in fresh vegetables during winter months, monotonous in its repetition. On the other hand, it was largely free of processed foods, of refined sugars, of the industrial additives that concern modern nutritionists. People died of many things in colonial Boston: disease, accident, violence, childbirth. But obesity was rare, and the diseases of modern affluence barely existed. The diet was hard, yes, but it was also, in its way, sufficient. It kept people alive and working in a world that demanded endless labour, and perhaps, in the end, that was all it needed to do. You finish your small beer, you wipe your mouth with the back of your hand, and you move toward the door, ready to face the muddy streets that wait outside. The door creaks as you push it open, and the morning hits you, not gently, not like a pleasant breeze carrying the scent of flowers, but like a wall of sensation that momentarily stops you in your tracks. The smell is the first thing. It is not any single smell, but a symphony of smells, layered and competing, some merely unpleasant and others genuinely nauseating. This is what colonial Boston smells like, and after a while you stop noticing it, the way you stopped noticing the wood smoke inside. But right now, stepping out for the first time today, it is overwhelming. The streets are not paved. Let's be clear about that immediately. What stretches before you is packed earth, churned by the passage of carts and feet and hooves into a surface that changes character with every shift in weather. After rain, it becomes mud. Thick, sucking mud that grabs at your shoes and refuses to let go. During dry spells, it hardens and cracks, releasing clouds of dust with every step. In winter, it freezes into treacherous ruts that can twist an ankle without warning. There is no comfortable season for walking in colonial Boston. There is only choosing which discomfort you prefer. The mud is not clean mud, if such a thing exists. Mixed into it is everything that the town's residents and animals deposit on a daily basis. Horse manure is omnipresent, dropped by the animals that provide transportation and hauling power, never fully cleared despite the efforts of scavengers both human and animal. Pig manure joins it, because pigs roam freely through many Boston neighbourhoods, serving as living garbage disposals that convert kitchen scraps into meat, while contributing their own waste to the general accumulation. Cow manure, goat droppings, chicken waste. The town is full of animals, and animals produce what animals produce. And then there is the human contribution. Chamber pots are emptied out of upper-story windows with only a cursory warning shout. Gardez l'eau, the cry goes, a corruption of French that has become standard urban practice. If you walk too close to the buildings, if you fail to look up when you hear the shout, you learn a lesson you will not soon forget. Privies dot the backyards and alleys, often shallow, often overflowing, their contents seeping into the soil that makes up the very streets you walk. There is no sewage system. There are no underground pipes carrying waste to treatment facilities. There is only the ground, absorbing whatever falls upon it, mixing and festering and emitting odours that would send a modern health inspector into fits. The streets themselves are narrow, far narrower than modern roads, designed for foot traffic and perhaps a single cart at a time. Many are barely 8 feet wide, hemmed in by buildings that rise 2 or 3 stories on either side. The buildings lean slightly, their upper floors jutting out over the street to claim additional space, creating dim corridors where sunlight rarely penetrates fully. This architectural practice, called jettying, makes economic sense. You are taxed on your ground floor footprint, so expanding upward costs nothing. But it creates streets that feel claustrophobic, tunnels of wood and plaster, rather than open thoroughfares. You pick your way along, trying to stay to the edges where occasional paving stones have been laid, where the ground is slightly firmer, where the worst of the mud might be avoided. But there is no truly safe path. Every step is a negotiation with the terrain, an assessment of risk, a small gamble on whether that particular stretch of ground will hold your weight or swallow your shoe. And you're not walking alone. The streets are already filling with the day's traffic, and in colonial Boston, traffic means bodies, human and animal, jostling and weaving, all trying to reach somewhere with varying degrees of urgency. A woman with a basket on her arm pushes past you, headed to market. A boy drives a small herd of geese before him, the birds honking their complaints and blocking the way. A cart pulled by a single weary horse takes up the entire width of the lane, forcing everyone to flatten against the buildings or wait until it passes. There is no traffic direction, no right-of-way convention that everyone agrees upon. There is only the eternal dance of urban movement, improvised anew with every encounter. The buildings you pass are mostly wood. Wooden frames, wooden siding, wooden shingles on the roofs. Brick exists but is reserved for the homes of the wealthy, for public buildings, for structures that want to announce their permanence and importance. Most of Boston is built of timber from the surrounding forests, quickly constructed, easily repaired, and terrifyingly flammable. You will return to this fact later, because fire haunts this town like a recurring nightmare. But for now, notice only how the wooden facades create a particular texture, weathered grey by salt air and sun, decorated with painted signs that announce the businesses within. The waterfront is not far. In truth, nothing in Boston is far. The town occupies a peninsula so small that you can walk from one end to the other in perhaps 20 minutes. The harbour is always present, always audible, always smelling of salt and tar and the particular funk of low tide. Even streets that don't directly border the water carry reminders. Sailors in their distinctive loose trousers, the cry of gulls overhead, the forest of masts visible over rooftops whenever you glance in the right direction. You pass a shop where a butcher has hung his wares in the open air. Sides of beef, strings of sausages, a pig's head staring with dead eyes at passers-by. Flies buzz around the meat despite the morning cool, and the butcher waves them away with a cloth that looks like it hasn't been washed since the previous century. This is normal. This is how meat is sold. The concept of refrigerated display cases remains as distant as the concept of spaceflight. You buy your meat from a man standing amid blood and sawdust, and you carry it home before it spoils, and you cook it today because tomorrow it will be questionable. Next door, a baker has set up his display. Loaves of bread stacked on a board that extends from his window into the street. Dark, round shapes that promise sustenance, if not excitement. The smell of baking competes briefly with all the other smells, a moment of warmth and yeast before the background odours reassert themselves. A small crowd has gathered, exchanging coins for bread, stuffing purchases into baskets and pockets. Bread is daily, bread is essential, bread is the closest thing to a universal food that colonial Boston knows. Someone shouts. You look up just in time to dodge the contents of a chamber pot, the splash landing mere feet from where you stand. The person who threw it has already disappeared from the window, and there is no point in shouting back. This is simply how things work. The streets absorb the waste, the rain washes it toward the harbour carries it out to sea, or so the theory goes. In practice, the accumulation never quite clears, never quite disappears, simply becomes part of the permanent texture of urban life. You step over a dead dog that lies in the gutter, already attracting attention from the town's crow population. Dead animals in the streets are common enough that they barely register. Someone will eventually move it, probably. Or the crows and rats will reduce it to bones, and the bones will be kicked aside, and eventually the spot will become unremarkable again. The cycle of urban decay and renewal continues constantly, visible and unmentioned, simply part of the landscape. A gentleman approaches from the opposite direction, and you step aside to let him pass. He is obvious at a glance. The quality of his coat, the silver buckles on his shoes, the white wig perched atop his head announcing status with every powdered curl. He does not acknowledge you. He does not need to. The social hierarchy is so clear, so deeply ingrained, that deference is automatic. You yield, he proceeds, and the transaction completes without a word exchanged. The streets of colonial Boston are a democracy of inconvenience, but a strict hierarchy of respect. The mud treats everyone equally. The smells assault every nostril regardless of breeding. But the choreography of deference, who yields to whom, who speaks first, who removes their hat in whose presence, this is precisely calibrated and universally understood. You know your place. Everyone knows their place. And the streets, for all their chaos, observe a deeper order that governs every interaction. You continue walking because walking is how you get everywhere in colonial Boston. Coaches exist for the wealthy, sedan chairs for those who can afford to pay bearers, but most people move on their own 2 feet, navigating the mud and the crowds and the smells with practiced determination. The town is small enough that nowhere takes truly long to reach, but the walking adds up. You will cover miles today, back and forth across this cramped peninsula, and by evening your legs will ache with the accumulated effort. But that evening is far away. For now there is only the next step, and the next, and the morning sun finally breaking through the clouds to illuminate the muddy chaos of colonial Boston in all its authentic, unglamorous, slightly horrifying glory. The harbour calls you forward, and you find yourself drawn toward Long Wharf like iron filings toward a magnet. This is the beating heart of colonial Boston, the structure that makes everything else possible, and even if your daily business takes you nowhere near the water, you cannot help but feel its gravitational pull. The wharf extends nearly half a mile into the harbour, a wooden peninsula built atop a peninsula, lined with warehouses and shops and crowds that never seem to thin regardless of the hour. As you approach, the soundscape shifts dramatically. The quiet clopping of hooves on packed earth gives way to a thunderous cacophony of commercial activity. Men shout to one another across the width of the wharf, their voices competing with the creak of ropes and the groan of loaded cranes. Barrels roll across wooden planks with a rumbling that you feel through the soles of your shoes. Somewhere, a ship's bell clangs, and somewhere else, someone is hammering. Always someone is hammering, repairing hulls, building crates, maintaining the endless wooden infrastructure that makes Atlantic trade possible. The smell changes too. The inland odours of livestock and human waste recede, replaced by the sharp tang of salt, the organic funk of low tide, the resinous sweetness of fresh-cut pine, and the darker notes of tar heated in great cauldrons for caulking seams. Ships cluster along the wharf's edges, their masts rising into the sky like a leafless forest, their hulls painted in colours that have faded and weathered, but still hint at blues and reds and greens. Some are small coastal vessels, single-masted sloops that carry goods between Boston and nearby ports. Others are ocean-going ships, their 3 masts and complex rigging speaking of voyages across the Atlantic, of weeks and months at sea, of destinations you will likely never visit. You make your way onto the wharf itself, joining the stream of humanity that flows in both directions. There are merchants in good coats inspecting cargo manifests, their faces pinched with the constant calculations of profit and loss. There are labourers stripped to their shirts despite the cool morning, muscles straining as they heave crates and roll barrels. There are women selling food from baskets, bread, cheese, dried fish for sailors about to depart, their calls adding to the general din. There are sailors everywhere, men from a dozen nations, speaking in accents that range from familiar English to utterly incomprehensible, their skin tanned and weathered by salt spray and foreign suns. A work gang moves past you, hauling ropes attached to a crane that is lifting cargo from a recently arrived ship. The foreman barks orders, and the men respond in unison, their movements synchronized by necessity. One misstep, one moment of inattention, and the heavy crate could swing wild, could crush a body with casual indifference. Injuries on the waterfront are common, deaths are not exactly rare. This is dangerous work, and the men who do it are not compensated in any way proportional to the risks they take. But the alternative is no work at all, and no work means no food, and no food means a different kind of death. So they haul, and they lift, and they hope that today is not the day the rope snaps. The goods flowing across this wharf represent the entire colonial economy in microcosm. From the holds of ships come manufactured items that the colonies cannot produce themselves. Fine cloth from England, metalwork forged in Birmingham and Sheffield, glass and paper, and 1,000 specialised products that require industrial infrastructure Boston simply doesn't have. From the warehouses that line the wharf goes the cargo of outbound vessels, lumber from the endless forests of New England, dried fish bound for Catholic Europe and Caribbean plantations, whale oil to light the lamps of London, furs trapped in the wilderness and bundled for fashionable markets overseas. And there is something else, something that moves through these wharves with such regularity that it barely draws comment. Human beings. Enslaved Africans arrive in the holds of ships, their numbers smaller than in southern ports but still significant. Indentured servants step blinking onto the wharf, their contracts of bondage already sold to waiting masters. Convicts transported from English prisons as an alternative to hanging shuffle along in chains, their labour sentenced to colonial buyers. The waterfront is a marketplace for human bodies, as surely as it is a marketplace for codfish and timber, and the distinction between cargo and person blurs in ways that would trouble a modern conscience but barely register in colonial minds. You pause to watch a ship being unloaded. It arrived yesterday from England, the word has spread, and its hold contains luxuries that Boston merchants have been awaiting for months. Tea, perhaps, those precious dried leaves that have begun their conquest of English-speaking throats. Finished clothing for those wealthy enough to import fashion, rather than make do with local tailors. Books, newspapers from London that are already weeks old but contain news that hasn't yet reached colonial ears. Sugar, refined white sugar that commands prices only the wealthy can afford. Each item comes off the ship with care, with documentation, with a chain of hands that passes it from sailor to labourer to warehouse to eventual buyer. The merchants who orchestrate all this stand at a slight remove from the physical work, their ledgers open, their pens scratching figures that will determine whether today has been profitable. These are the men who own Boston, really, not the crown officials who represent distant authority, but the commercial class that has accumulated wealth through decades of shrewd dealing. Their counting houses line the streets behind the wharf, sober brick buildings where clerks hunch over desks and the smell of ink mingles with the dust of old paper. From these offices, letters go out to correspondents in London and Bristol, in Barbados and Halifax, maintaining the networks of credit and supply that make trade possible. There is a particular sound that characterises Long Wharf, beneath all the shouting and hammering and creaking, the sound of money being made. Not literal coins clinking. Most transactions are recorded in ledgers rather than paid in metal, but the abstract music of commerce, of goods moving from where they are plentiful to where they are needed, of risk taken and sometimes rewarded. Boston is a trading town first and foremost. Everything else, the churches, the schools, the political debates that will eventually lead to revolution, everything rests on this foundation of buying and selling, of ships arriving and departing, of the waterfront's ceaseless activity. Sailors are everywhere, and they are a category unto themselves. A sailor in colonial Boston is something of a citizen of everywhere and nowhere. A person whose home is whatever ship currently employs him, whose nation is whatever flag happens to fly from the stern. These men have seen the world in ways that most Bostonians never will. They have walked the streets of London and Bristol, have sweated in Caribbean heat, have perhaps visited African coasts or Mediterranean ports, or places even more remote. Their stories, told in waterfront taverns after dark, paint pictures of a planet far larger and stranger than the cramped peninsula of Boston, and the young men who listen dream of their own voyages while probably lacking any realistic sense of what they would entail. The sailor's life is brutal. Months at sea in cramped quarters, eating food that would challenge the strongest stomach, facing storms that could swallow a ship whole, subject to discipline enforced with rope end and worse. Disease spreads through crews with terrifying speed. Fools from rigging break bodies on deck. The pay, when it comes, barely compensates for the dangers endured, and yet the waterfront never lacks for sailors, because for some men escaping something, men seeking something, men for whom the land holds nothing, the sea offers a kind of freedom that the shore cannot match. You step aside as a group of sailors rolls a barrel past you, their coordinated effort moving the heavy container with surprising efficiency. They are speaking in an accent you cannot quite place, somewhere in the British Isles certainly, but beyond that the vowels and rhythms defeat your ear. It doesn't matter. On the waterfront, a shared task creates its own understanding, and the barrel reaches its destination regardless of what language its movers dream in. The morning wears on. The sun has climbed higher, though you barely notice it amid the activity that surrounds you. The wharf is a world unto itself, a place where the normal rhythms of colonial life give way to the more urgent rhythms of commerce, where the hours are measured not by church bells but by tides and sailing schedules. And somewhere in the press of bodies and cargo, somewhere in the creak of ropes and the shouts of foremen, you understand something essential about Boston. This town exists because of this wharf. This wharf exists because of the sea, and the sea connects this small colonial outpost to a world that extends far beyond the horizon, a world of empires and markets and millions of people who will never set foot on this particular stretch of wooden planks, but whose lives are nevertheless tangled with yours in ways too complex to fully comprehend. You're perhaps 12 years old when your father brings you to the shop of a master craftsman and leaves you there. This is not abandonment, not in the eyes of colonial law and custom. This is opportunity. This is your future being secured in the only way that makes sense in a world without public schools, without social safety nets, without any path to respectability that doesn't involve learning to make something useful with your hands. You're becoming an apprentice, and your childhood, such as it was, is effectively over. The indenture your father signed binds you to this master for 7 years during which you will live under his roof, eat at his table, and obey his commands as surely as if he were your own parent. In exchange, he will teach you the mysteries of his trade, whatever that trade may be. Perhaps you are to become a cooper, shaping barrels that will carry Boston's goods across the Atlantic. Perhaps you will learn the silversmith's art, hammering precious metal into spoons and candlesticks, and the elaborate tea services that wealthy families display. Perhaps you will be a printer, a blacksmith, a cabinet maker, a shipwright. The specific trade matters less than the system itself, which will shape your daily existence in ways you cannot yet fully imagine. You wake before dawn because the master wakes before dawn, and the master's schedule is your schedule now. The bed you share with another apprentice, there is always another apprentice, often 2 or 3, is hard and cold, the blankets thin. You dress quickly, your numb fingers fumbling with buttons, and you make your way downstairs where the day's first tasks already await. Perhaps you must start the fire in the forge, working the bellows until the coals glow orange and the heat begins to push back the morning chill. Perhaps you must grind pigments for a painter's palette, or sort leather scraps for a shoemaker's use, or sweep the accumulated sawdust from a carpenter's floor. The specific chore varies, but the principle remains constant. You are the lowest rung on the ladder, and the lowest rungs do the work that no one else wants to do. The master appears, and your real education begins. This is not education as a modern school would recognize it. No textbooks, no structured curriculum, no grades or assessments. This is learning by watching, by doing, by failing and being corrected, by slowly absorbing the 1,000 small skills that together constitute a trade. The master works, and you observe. He explains, sometimes, if he is the explaining type, but many masters simply expect you to figure it out, to pick up through observation what words cannot efficiently convey. You will make mistakes. You will make many mistakes. The master will correct them with varying degrees of patience, and you will learn eventually to make fewer. The hours are long. 12 hours is a standard workday, 14 or 15 not unusual during busy periods. There are breaks for meals, but the meals are quick and the breaks are short. There is the Sabbath when no work may be done, but the Sabbath is for church, for prayer, for sitting in enforced stillness while your young body aches to move. Entertainment is scarce and viewed with suspicion. The idle mind, colonial wisdom holds, invites the devil's attention. Better to keep hands and thoughts occupied with productive labour than to risk the moral dangers of free time. Your master controls nearly every aspect of your life. You need his permission to leave the shop, to visit your family, to spend any money you might manage to acquire. You cannot marry. Not that you would, at 12 or 13, but the prohibition extends throughout your apprenticeship until you reach 21 or so. You cannot take on work for yourself, cannot compete in any way with the master whose craft you are learning. Your body and your time belong to him as surely as if he had purchased them outright, which in a sense he has. The indenture your father signed transferred custody of you to another man, and that transfer is recognised by law and custom as entirely legitimate. Some masters are kind. They take genuine interest in their apprentices' development, teach generously, treat the young people in their charge as something close to family. Some masters are cruel. They work apprentices beyond endurance, beat them for minor infractions, provide food and shelter barely adequate for survival. Most masters fall somewhere in the middle, neither particularly warm nor particularly harsh, simply running a business in which apprentices are a necessary component. You hope for kindness, you expect indifference, you fear cruelty, and whichever you receive, you have little recourse. Running away is punishable by extended service, and complaints to authorities rarely produce results, unless the abuse is dramatic and well documented. There is a peculiar intimacy to this arrangement. You live in your master's house, eat at his table, observe his family life in all its private details. You know when he argues with his wife, when he drinks too much cider after supper, when his business is struggling or thriving. He knows your habits equally well, when you slack off, when you try hard, whether you have the aptitude that will eventually make you a competent journeyman. The relationship is not quite parent and child, not quite employer and employee, but something in between, something that doesn't map neatly onto modern categories. The dame of the house, your master's wife, occupies a complicated position in your life. She often supervises your domestic behaviour, ensuring you wash your hands before meals, say your prayers before bed, maintain the basic standards of conduct expected in a respectable household. She may show you maternal kindness, or she may resent the extra mouth to feed. Her kitchen produces the food you eat, her household the order that structures your days. You are careful to please her because her displeasure can make your life notably harder, and because, in some ways that matter, she has as much authority over your domestic existence as the master has over your working one. There are hierarchies among apprentices themselves. The newest arrival occupies the lowest position, assigned the worst tasks, given the least comfortable sleeping spot, hazed in small ways by those who arrived before and endured the same treatment. As years pass, you rise through these informal ranks. The tasks become more interesting, more directly related to the actual craft. The master begins to trust you with work that matters, that might actually be sold to customers. By your 5th or 6th year, if all goes well, you are performing skilled labour under supervision, producing goods that contribute genuinely to the shop's output. Historians still argue whether the apprenticeship system was more beneficial or exploitative. On one hand, it provided genuine education to young people who had no other access to marketable skills, creating pathways to respectable adulthood that did not depend on family wealth. On the other hand, it extracted years of labour from miners, often under harsh conditions, with minimal protections for their welfare. The truth, as usual, lies in the vast middle ground where individual circumstances varied enormously. Some apprentices emerged from their indentures as skilled craftsmen ready to make their way in the world. Others were damaged by years of abuse and neglect, their potential crushed before it could fully develop. At the end of 7 years, if you have completed your term honourably, you become a journeyman. The word means exactly what it suggests. A day worker, someone who labours for daily wages rather than under long-term indenture. You're now free to work for any master who will hire you, to travel from town to town seeking employment, to accumulate the capital and reputation that might eventually allow you to become a master yourself. You're not yet fully arrived. You're not yet a property owner, not yet a voter, not yet the kind of substantial citizen whose opinions carry weight. But you have made the transition from child to adult in the terms that colonial society recognises, and the path forward is at least visible if still long. For now, though, you are 12, or 13, or 14. You are small and tired and far from home. The master is calling, his voice carrying an edge of impatience that you have learned to heed immediately. There is work to do. There is always work to do. And your future depends on doing it well enough, for long enough, that 7 years from now, you will emerge with something to show for your suffering. You rise from whatever brief rest you are enjoying, and you return to the shop and you begin again. If you wake as a woman in colonial Boston, your day begins earlier than anyone else's and ends after everyone else has gone to bed. This is not occasional overtime. This is not a particularly busy week. This is every single day from the moment you are old enough to be useful until the moment you are too old or too sick to continue. The work never ends because the work can never end. The household's survival depends on labour that must be performed constantly, and that labour falls primarily on female shoulders. You rise in the darkness, as we have already seen, and your first task is the fire. The hearth is the centre of domestic life, and the fire must be coaxed from last night's embers into today's flames. This requires skill acquired through years of practice, knowing how to arrange the kindling, how to work the bellows, how to avoid smothering the fragile new flames with too much fuel too quickly. A fire that dies means starting from scratch with flint and steel, a process tedious enough that you learn to keep that flame alive almost instinctively. With the fire going, the cooking begins. Breakfast may be simple, but someone must prepare even simple meals, and that someone is you. The iron pot must be positioned over the flames, the ingredients assembled, the constant stirring and tending that prevents burning performed. While breakfast cooks, you fetch water, not from a convenient tap, but from a well that may be across the yard or down the street, carrying heavy buckets that strain your shoulders and slop cold water onto your skirts. You may make this trip several times before the morning is through, because water is consumed faster than any single carring can supply. The children wake, and they require attention. Dressing, feeding, wiping faces, settling disputes, preventing the toddlers from crawling too close to the fire, or eating something that will poison them. This supervisory work overlays everything else you do. Colonial households have many children, infant mortality being what it is, and those children are present constantly, underfoot, demanding, needing. There is no daycare to absorb them for 8 hours. There is no grandparent to take them for the afternoon. There is only you, managing their chaos while simultaneously managing everything else. And then there is the spinning. If you are a woman of ordinary means in colonial Boston, you spin thread. You may not do this every single day, but you do it most days, for hours at a time, because without homespun thread there is no homespun cloth, and without homespun cloth there are no clothes, no bedding, no household textiles of any kind. The spinning wheel, or the simpler drop spindle for those who cannot afford a wheel, becomes an extension of your body, a tool you operate almost unconsciously while your mind drifts to other concerns. Spinning is not difficult in the sense of requiring great intellectual effort, but it is demanding in the sense of requiring attention that cannot lapse. A moment's distraction produces uneven thread, thread that will weaken the cloth, cloth that will wear out prematurely. The work is repetitive, hypnotic, endless. You spin wool into yarn, flax into linen thread, hour after hour, day after day, building up the stores of fibre that your family's textile needs require. A single garment represents dozens of hours of spinning before anyone even begins to weave or cut or sew. Laundry, when it happens, is an all-day affair. This is not a task you undertake lightly or frequently. Washing clothes in colonial Boston means heating enormous quantities of water over the fire, transferring that water to wooden tubs, scrubbing each garment by hand with harsh lye soap that strips the oils from your skin, wringing out water by sheer muscle power, and hanging everything to dry on lines or bushes. The process is exhausting, hard on the body, impossible to complete for an entire household in a single day. This is why laundry happens perhaps once a month, why the shift or shirt that touches your skin is the only regularly washed garment, why colonial Boston carries a persistent undertone of human smell that modern noses would find startling. Food preservation occupies much of your mental energy, even when you are not actively engaged in it. You must think constantly about what the household will eat not just today, but next week, next month, next winter. Vegetables must be pickled or dried or stored in root cellars. Meat must be salted or smoked before it spoils. Fruits must be turned into preserves or dried or made into cider. The margin for error is thin. Spoiled food represents not just wasted labour but genuine hunger, and hunger in colonial Boston is never far away for those who manage their resources poorly. You're also the household's primary medical provider. When children fall sick, when your husband comes home with a wound, when anyone in the household needs care, you provide it. Your medical knowledge is a mixture of folk remedies passed down through generations, herbal preparations you have learned from other women, and prayer. You know which plants reduce fever, which poultices draw out infection, which teas ease a cough. Whether these treatments actually work is a question modern medicine would answer skeptically, but they represent the best available options in a world where professional physicians are expensive, scarce, and often no more effective than your home remedies anyway. The sewing never stops. Clothes wear out and someone must repair them. Children grow and someone must let out hems, add fabric, eventually make entirely new garments. Household textiles, sheets, towels, napkins, aprons, require constant maintenance. You sew by daylight when you can, by candlelight when you must, squinting at stitches in the dim illumination, pricking your fingers with needles that are never quite sharp enough. The calluses on your fingertips tell the story of years spent pushing needles through resistant fabric. There is a phrase historians use to describe women's work in colonial America: deputy husbands. When the man of the house is absent, travelling for business, serving in the militia, simply away for the day, the woman assumes his economic functions as well as her own. She may negotiate with customers, manage apprentices, make business decisions that would normally fall to her husband. This dual role is recognised by law and custom, and many colonial women prove remarkably capable at it. But it means that women's work is not merely domestic labour. It is also, frequently, commercial labour, performed on top of everything else without any reduction in the underlying domestic demands. And yet, despite all this, women in colonial Boston have essentially no formal power. They cannot vote, they cannot hold office. Upon marriage, their legal identity is absorbed into their husbands, a doctrine called coverture that renders married women legally invisible. The property they brought to the marriage becomes their husband's property. The wages they might earn belong to him as well. They exist in the eyes of the law as extensions of men rather than as independent persons. There is a dark irony here that historians still struggle to fully articulate. The women who performed the labour that kept colonial households functioning, who managed economies of food and fibre and child-rearing, who served as the essential infrastructure of daily life. These women had less formal power than the men who depended utterly on their work. The system could not function without them, and yet the system was designed to minimise their authority at every turn. Some women pushed back against these constraints, finding spaces for autonomy within the restrictions. Widows occupied a peculiar legal position. Upon a husband's death, a woman recovered some of her legal personality, could own property in her own name, could conduct business without a man's oversight. Some widows chose not to remarry precisely because remarriage would mean surrendering this hard-won independence. Others used informal influence, over husbands, over community opinion, over the domestic sphere they controlled, to exercise power that the formal structures denied them. But for most women, most of the time, colonial life meant work without end, and authority without recognition. You rise before dawn, and you work until after dark. You manage the household that makes everything else possible. And when historians write about colonial Boston, they too often write about merchants and ministers and magistrates, the men whose names appear in official records, while the women who made those men's lives possible fade into the background, their labour essential and their stories largely untold. The fire needs tending, the children are crying, the spinning waits, and somewhere in the endless cycle of tasks you find moments of satisfaction, of connection, of joy, the bread that rises perfectly, the child who masters a new skill, the quiet hour after everyone else has fallen asleep when the house is finally, briefly, yours alone. These moments sustain you. They have to. There is no alternative but to continue. The child who runs past you in the street, barefoot despite the mud, could be 7 or 8. It's hard to tell because colonial children are dressed as miniature adults, rather than in the specialised clothing modern kids wear. There is no distinction between childhood fashion and adult fashion. There is simply clothing scaled down to smaller bodies. The boy wears breeches just like his father's. The girl wears stays and petticoats just like her mother's, though perhaps a bit simpler, a bit less restricting. They look like shrunken grown-ups, which in a sense is exactly what colonial society considers them to be. The concept of childhood as a distinct phase of life, a protected period of play and learning and gradual development, barely exists in colonial Boston. Children are workers. Children are, from remarkably young ages, expected to contribute to the household economy in whatever ways their developing bodies allow. A 5-year-old can fetch water, can feed chickens, can mind a younger sibling. A 7-year-old can help with spinning, can run errands, can assist with the simpler tasks of whatever trade the household practices. By 10 or 12, children are performing substantial labour, apprenticed to trades, working in the fields if the family farms, helping their mothers manage households that demand endless attention. This is not cruelty exactly, at least not by colonial standards. It is simply necessity. Households need labour. Labour is expensive when you have to hire it. Children represent labour that you produce yourself, that you raise and train, that you can deploy without paying wages. Every colonial household is in effect a small enterprise, and children are the unpaid workers who make that enterprise viable. Love and affection certainly exist. Parents adore their children then as now, but love and affection coexist with expectations of productivity that would strike modern parents as severe. Play exists, but it is viewed with suspicion. The Puritan worldview that still dominates colonial Boston holds that human beings are born sinful, corrupted by original sin from their first breath, and that left to their own devices, children will naturally drift toward wickedness. Idleness is the devil's workshop. Free time invites mischief. Play, particularly play that seems purely frivolous, suggests a moral failing that must be corrected. Children who play too much, who seem too devoted to games and amusement, are children whose souls are in danger. This doesn't mean that colonial children never play. They do, because children are children regardless of what the adults around them believe. They play with dolls made from rags and corn husks. They roll hoops down streets, throw balls, chase each other in games of tag that would be recognizable to any modern kid. They find moments between tasks, spaces where adults aren't watching, opportunities to be children despite everything. But these moments are stolen rather than scheduled, grabbed rather than granted. There is no culture of organised playtime, no birthday parties with clowns and cake, no conception that childhood should be a period devoted primarily to enjoyment. Education occupies a complicated place in this landscape. Puritans valued literacy, valued it intensely, but for specific reasons that might not match modern educational philosophy. The ability to read was considered essential because it allowed direct access to scripture, allowed the individual soul to engage with God's word without priestly mediation. Children were taught to read primarily so they could read the Bible, could study catechism, could absorb the religious instruction that might save their souls from eternal damnation. This was not education for personal enrichment or career advancement. This was education as spiritual survival. Girls learned to read in dame schools, informal establishments run by local women who gathered neighbourhood children in their homes and taught basic literacy and domestic skills. These schools were cheap, accessible, and limited. A girl might learn her letters, might learn to read simple texts, might absorb some arithmetic sufficient for household management. But higher education was not for girls. The Latin grammar schools that prepared boys for Harvard College did not admit female students. The assumption was clear: girls would become wives and mothers, and the education required for those roles was domestic rather than academic. Boys of middling families might attend grammar school, learning Latin and Greek, studying the classical texts that an educated gentleman was expected to know. These schools were rigorous, demanding, and disciplinarian. Teachers employed corporal punishment liberally. The rod was not a last resort but a standard tool, applied for errors in recitation, for behavioural infractions, for the general purpose of driving the natural sinfulness out of young minds. A boy who could not conjugate Latin verbs correctly could expect physical pain. A boy who spoke out of turn could expect worse. For boys of the labouring classes, formal schooling was often minimal or absent entirely. An apprenticeship might include basic literacy instruction from the master, but the emphasis was on practical skills rather than book learning. You needed to be able to read contracts, to keep basic accounts, to manage the documentation that trade required. Beyond that, academic education was a luxury that working families could not afford and did not particularly value. Better to learn a trade that would put food on the table than to study Latin that would never earn a penny. There is a quirky detail that illuminates colonial attitudes toward children. naming practices. If a child died, and children died with devastating frequency, parents would sometimes give the next child of the same sex the same name. A family might have 2, even 3 children named Mary, the name passing from one short-lived girl to the next, as if the identity itself were being preserved despite the body's failure to survive. This practice seems strange to modern sensibilities, seems to deny the individuality of each child, but it reflects a world where death was so common that naming practices had to accommodate it. The psychological impact of childhood mortality on colonial families is something historians still debate. Did parents withhold emotional attachment, knowing that any given child had odds of perhaps 1 in 3 of dying before adulthood? Did they love their children just as intensely as modern parents, experiencing devastating grief with each small coffin lowered into the ground? The truth probably varied between families, between individuals, between the particular circumstances of each loss. But the deaths were constant, the church graveyards filling with tiny headstones, and every parent in colonial Boston knew that their child might be next. Religion permeated every aspect of childhood. Children were expected to attend lengthy church services, to sit still on hard wooden benches for hours, while ministers delivered sermons on theological fine points that even adults struggled to follow. They were catechized regularly, questioned on matters of doctrine, drilled on the correct answers to questions about sin and salvation. The fear of hell was not an abstract concept, but a vivid reality, described in terms calculated to terrify young minds into obedience. If you are 7 years old in colonial Boston, you have probably spent hours imagining the flames that await the unregenerate, wondering whether your own soul is among the damned. And yet, for all this harshness, for all the labour and discipline and constant reminders of mortality, children remained children. They laughed, they ran, they formed friendships and rivalries. They were curious about the world, annoyed by adult restrictions, eager to grow up even as adults told them to enjoy their youth. The structures of colonial childhood tried to contain and shape them, but the essential nature of childhood, its energy, its resilience, its stubbornness, persisted despite everything. You see it in the child splashing through the mud, playing some game that exists outside adult sanction, being for a brief moment simply a child in a world that rarely allows such simplicity. The bell tolls, and you make your way toward the meeting house, because Sunday in colonial Boston is not optional. The Sabbath is a legal requirement, a social expectation, and a spiritual necessity all rolled into one, and failure to attend services invites consequences ranging from public shaming to actual fines. You dress in your best clothes, which are also your only clothes, but you've brushed them and straightened them as much as possible, and you join the stream of neighbours walking toward the large wooden structure that dominates the town centre. The meeting house itself is not what you might picture if you're imagining a modern church. There is no steeple piercing the sky, no stained glass windows casting coloured light across pews, no pipe organ preparing to thunder the opening hymn. Puritans are deeply suspicious of ornamentation in religious practice. They believe that the medieval Catholic Church cluttered worship with unnecessary decoration, distracting souls from the pure encounter with God that salvation requires. So the meeting house is plain, unpainted clapboards outside, whitewash plaster within, clear glass windows that let in light without any pictorial interference. The pews are assigned by status, a seating arrangement that makes the social hierarchy visible and unavoidable every single week. Wealthy merchants and their families occupy the front rows, close to the pulpit, visible to all. Behind them come the middling classes, shopkeepers, artisans, minor officials, arranged in careful gradations that everyone understands. The poor sit at the back, in pews near the door where cold draughts penetrate and the minister's voice grows faint. And certain people, servants, enslaved individuals, those of lowest status, may not sit in pews at all but on benches or standing spots designated for their use. You find your assigned seat, and you prepare for the hours ahead. Hours, plural, because Puritan services are not brief. A morning service might last 3 hours or more, featuring prayers, psalm singing without instrumental accompaniment, readings from scripture, and the main event, a sermon that can easily stretch beyond 2 hours of dense theological exposition. The minister stands in the high pulpit, elevated above the congregation, and he speaks in a style that values substance over entertainment. This is not a performance. This is instruction in eternal truths, delivered with the seriousness such truths deserve. The benches are hard. There is no padding, no cushioning, just wooden planks that become progressively more uncomfortable as the hours pass. You shift your weight, trying to find a tolerable position, but there is no tolerable position. You're meant to be slightly uncomfortable, slightly physically engaged with your situation. Comfort breeds complacency, and complacency breeds spiritual danger. The discomfort is, in its way, the point, and there are the tithing men watching. These are officials charged with maintaining order during services, and they patrol the aisles with long poles topped with various implements. One end typically features a hard knob for prodding men who fall asleep, and men do fall asleep, exhausted from the week's labour, lulled by the minister's droning voice, head gradually dropping until the tithing man's staff delivers a sharp reminder to the ribs. The other end often features a foxtail or feather for tickling women and children awake, though the distinction seems designed more to amuse than to reflect any genuine difference in treatment. The content of the sermon varies, but usually involves intense examination of doctrinal points, extended metaphors drawn from Scripture, and vivid descriptions of the fate awaiting sinners who fail to achieve saving grace. Hell is real in these sermons, a physical place of eternal torment described in terms meant to terrify. The flames, the suffering, the endless duration of damnation. The minister paints these pictures with rhetorical skill designed to shake souls from complacency, and it works. You sit there, listening, and you feel genuine fear, genuine concern for your eternal destiny. This is not abstract theology. This is your soul hanging in the balance. But the minister also describes heaven, the reward awaiting those whom God has chosen for salvation. The catch, and it's a significant catch, is that you cannot earn salvation through good works or right behaviour. Salvation is God's gift, extended to the elect according to God's inscrutable will. You cannot know for certain whether you are among the elect. You can only look for signs, examine your conscience for evidence of saving grace, and hope that your anxiety about salvation is itself evidence that God is working within you. This uncertainty haunts Puritan theology and Puritan lives, the nagging fear that all your efforts, all your prayers, all your righteous behaviour might count for nothing if God has not chosen you for heaven. After the morning service, you return home for a meal, but the Sabbath's obligations are not complete. An afternoon service awaits, shorter than the morning's but still substantial, still demanding your presence in that same uncomfortable pew, still testing your ability to maintain attention through another sermon, more prayers, more psalm singing without the support of instruments. By the time the day ends, you have spent perhaps 6 hours in religious observance, not counting the prayers and scripture readings that bookend meals at home. The Sabbath is not, however, solely a matter of attending services. The entire day is meant to be set apart from ordinary activities, devoted to spiritual concerns rather than worldly ones. Work is prohibited, genuinely prohibited, enforceable by fine and public censure. You cannot cook elaborate meals, cannot tend your shop, cannot engage in the labour that fills every other day. Even recreation is suspect. The Sabbath is not a day off in the modern sense, not a weekend devoted to leisure. It is a day devoted to God, and activities that distract from that devotion are inappropriate. This creates a peculiar atmosphere. The streets of Boston are quiet on Sunday, eerily quiet compared to the bustle of weekdays. The shops are closed, the markets empty, the waterfront largely still. Families move between home and meeting house and back again. Children who are normally scattered across the town pursuing work and play are gathered, supervised, contained. The day has a quality of suspension, of time held aside from ordinary flow. Some people chafe against these restrictions. By the 1700s, the iron grip of first-generation Puritanism has loosened somewhat, and not everyone approaches the Sabbath with equal enthusiasm. Young people in particular sometimes resist, sneaking away to engage in forbidden recreation, resenting the hours of enforced stillness. But the social pressure to conform remains strong. Your neighbours notice if you skip services. Your minister notices. The tithing men notice. And in a community as small and interconnected as colonial Boston, being noticed for the wrong reasons can have lasting consequences for your reputation and your prospects. There is something exhausting about the Sabbath, and something oddly restful as well. The prohibition on work means that for one day each week, the endless labour that defines colonial life pauses. You cannot spin on Sunday, You cannot tend the shop on Sunday. You cannot haul and carry and scrub. The body rests, even if the spirit is meant to remain vigorously engaged. And by evening, as the sun sets and the Sabbath officially ends, there is a moment of release, of ordinary life resuming, of the world returning to its regular rhythms. You walk home from the final service, the minister's words still echoing in your thoughts. Perhaps you are saved. Perhaps you are damned. You cannot know, not with certainty, not while you still draw breath. You can only continue, praying, working, hoping, examining your soul for signs of grace, and trusting that if God has chosen you, that choice will eventually become clear. It is a strange theology to modern ears, at once reassuring and terrifying, but it is the theology that shapes your life in colonial Boston, and you have learned to live within its uncomfortable contours. The tavern door swings open, and you step into an atmosphere so thick with smoke that your eyes immediately begin to water. This is not a genteel establishment with polished brass fixtures and uniformed staff. This is a colonial ordinary, the common term for the places where ordinary people gather to drink, to talk, to warm themselves by fires that never quite seem warm enough, and to conduct the informal business that greases the wheels of Boston's economy. The air smells of wood smoke, spilled ale, tobacco, and the accumulated sweat of the men who have crowded inside, escaping the evening chill. Taverns are everywhere in colonial Boston, so numerous that they alarm moralists who worry about the city's collective soul. Estimates suggest one tavern for every 20 adult residents, a saturation that would make even modern drinking districts seem restrained. But these establishments are not merely places to consume alcohol. They are the living rooms of colonial society, the spaces where community happens in ways that cramped private homes cannot accommodate. Business deals are negotiated over mugs of flip. News from other colonies spreads through the room. Political opinions find voice that would be dangerous in more official settings. The tavern is where colonial Boston truly talks. You find a spot on a bench near the fire, squeezing in between a sailor whose accent marks him as Irish, and a tradesman whose leather apron identifies his work even off the job. Nobody objects to your presence. Nobody particularly welcomes it either. The tavern operates on a logic of functional anonymity. You are one body among many, entitled to warmth and drink so long as you can pay, not required to explain yourself or make conversation unless you choose. The drink of choice, if you have any means at all, is flip. This is a colonial concoction that sounds strange to modern ears. Strong beer mixed with rum, sweetened with molasses, and then brought to a frothy, caramelized warmth by plunging a red-hot iron poker directly into the mug. The poker, called a loggerhead, spends the evening resting in the tavern's fire, pulled out periodically to serve customers whose flip has grown cold. The sizzle when the hot iron hits the liquid, the steam that rises, the particular scorched sweet smell, these are the sensory signatures of colonial tavern life. The drink itself is potent, warming, and capable of producing the kind of intoxication that the morning's small beer could never achieve. Other options exist. Hard cider is cheap and plentiful, the default beverage for those watching their pennies. Wine is available for the wealthy, imported from Spain or France at prices that mark its consumption as a statement of status. Rum, straight and undiluted, provides quick oblivion for those who seek it. The tavern keeper moves behind his bar, measuring and pouring with the easy efficiency of long practice, his face neutral as he serves sailors and merchants and ministers alike. The conversation around you rises and falls in unpredictable waves. Two men near the window are arguing about the quality of a recent shipment of timber, their voices growing louder as the dispute intensifies. A group at another table has cornered a sailor recently returned from Barbados, peppering him with questions about conditions in the Sugar Islands, about the weather, about the fortunes to be made or lost in that distant heat. Someone is telling a joke badly, his companions laughing more at his fumbling delivery than at the punchline itself. And there, in a corner booth away from the main crowd, a smaller group speaks in lower tones. Their faces are shadowed by the tavern's dim lighting, their conversation inaudible beneath the general noise. This is a different kind of tavern function. The private meeting, the political discussion, the exchange of ideas that might prove dangerous if overheard by the wrong ears. Colonial Boston is still decades from revolution, but the seeds of discontent are already sprouting, and tavern backrooms provide the soil in which radical thoughts can grow. Women are present, but not numerous. Respectable women do not frequent taverns, not as customers. The The space is coded masculine, and a woman who appears alone invites uncomfortable assumptions. But tavern keepers' wives and daughters work the room, carrying trays of drinks, bringing food from the kitchen, managing the establishment alongside their husbands. Some women operate taverns themselves, particularly widows who have inherited the business and find it provides income that other occupations cannot match. These female taverners are respected figures, businesswomen in an era when such roles are rare. The food available is simple: bread and cheese, meat pies that have been warming near the fire, perhaps some cold sliced beef or pork for those who want something substantial. This is not restaurant cuisine. This is sustenance, fuel to accompany the drinking, something to fill the stomach so the alcohol doesn't hit quite so hard. You order a pie and find it adequate. The crust flaky if heavy, the filling seasoned with pepper and not much else. The whole thing warm enough to provide comfort on a cold night. As the evening progresses, the crowd thickens. Men arrive after completing their day's work, seeking companionship and warmth. The noise level rises. Arguments grow more animated, laughter louder, the line between friendly conversation and potential conflict sometimes dangerously thin. Tavern fights are common enough that every establishment keeps a watchful eye out for trouble, and a word from the tavern keeper can summon assistance if needed. But most nights pass without serious incident, the alcohol mellowing rather than inflaming, the company providing what lonely men need most: connection. There is a democracy to the tavern that doesn't exist elsewhere in colonial society. The rigid hierarchies of church and street dissolve somewhat in the smoky dimness. A merchant might find himself in conversation with a dock worker, their exchange lubricated by shared drink into something approaching equality. A man of no particular importance might discover that his opinion carries weight when expressed in the right company, that influence can be wielded even by those without formal power. The tavern is where colonial Boston's formal structures bend, where the gaps between classes can be, temporarily, provisionally, bridged. But don't romanticize this too much. The hierarchy remains, even here. The best seats near the fire go to those who spend the most. The merchant and the dock worker might converse, but both understand who is whose social superior, and certain people are not welcome at all, or rather, are welcome only in certain taverns, in certain parts of town, under certain conditions. Enslaved people have little access to this world. Free black Bostonians face restrictions and suspicious glances. The tavern's democracy is a democracy of white men, its fellowship bounded by the same exclusions that mark colonial society more broadly. You finish your flip and consider ordering another. The fire is warm, the conversation around you engaging, the prospect of returning to your cold room unappealing. But you have work in the morning, and the morning comes early regardless of how late you stay out. So you pay your tab, nod to the tavern keeper, and push back out into the night. The cold hits you immediately, the contrast with the tavern's warmth almost shocking. The streets are quieter now, most people having retreated indoors. A night watch calls the hour from somewhere nearby, his voice carrying through the still air. The moon is up, casting enough light to navigate by, and you make your way home through streets that look different in darkness. More ominous, more mysterious, the familiar landmarks transformed into strange shapes. The tavern's warmth fades from your body quickly, and by the time you reach your door you're shivering again. But there is something in your chest that wasn't there this morning. Connection. Conversation. The simple pleasure of having been, for a few hours, part of something larger than yourself. The tavern provides this, and colonial Boston knows it. Tomorrow you will work, and the day after that you will work again. But tonight, for a few hours, you are a citizen of the Republic of the Tavern, equal to all who sat beside you, part of the eternal conversation that makes community possible. The meal set before you on the trestle table is not what you would choose if choice were available. But choice is not available. Choice is a luxury that colonial Boston reserves for the wealthy, and so you eat what exists, what preservation has kept edible, what the season happens to provide. Supper, the main meal of the day, is a family affair. Everyone gathered around the table as the last light fades outside the window, and the fire crackles its orange warmth. The central dish is boiled meat, probably beef, though it could be pork or mutton depending on what the household slaughtered or purchased recently. It has been simmering in the iron pot for hours, cooked until tender, submerged in liquid that has become a grey-brown broth flecked with floating fat. Alongside the meat are root vegetables. Turnips, definitely, their slightly bitter flavour a constant presence in colonial cooking, along with carrots or parsnips or whatever else came out of the cellar storage. These too have been boiling, softened into a consistency that requires no chewing, flavoured by the meat broth in which they've spent the afternoon. You receive your portion on a wooden trencher, which is essentially a flat board with a slight depression, the predecessor to the plate. Pewter plates exist for those with means, but wood is cheaper and serves the purpose. You eat with a spoon and perhaps a knife. Forks are slowly spreading through colonial society, but remain somewhat unusual, somewhat suspicious, associated with foreign affectation. Your fingers do much of the work, tearing meat, scooping vegetables, bringing food to mouth in ways that would horrify a modern etiquette instructor. The taste is not bad exactly. Salt dominates, as salt dominates almost everything in colonial cookery. The preservation method imparts its flavour to whatever it preserves. The meat is savoury if monotonous, the vegetables earthy and filling. There is bread on the table, dark and dense, and you tear off a piece to soak in the broth, extracting every bit of nourishment from the meal. Nothing is wasted. Every scrap of food represents labour and expense that cannot be squandered. To drink there is cider. Hard cider, fermented, the standard table beverage of New England. It is slightly sour, slightly fizzy, slightly alcoholic, and it complements the heavy food in a way that water never could. Children drink a diluted version, or perhaps small beer, consuming alcohol with every meal from the age of toddlerhood onward. This would alarm modern parents, but in colonial context it represents simple necessity. The alternatives are water that might kill you or nothing at all. Historians still argue about the overall quality of the colonial diet. Some emphasise its deficiencies, the lack of fresh vegetables during winter months, the excessive salt, the monotony that ground down the pleasure of eating. Others note that colonists generally had more food than their European counterparts, that the abundant land and resources of North America meant that even modest families ate meat with regularity that would astonish a European peasant. The truth is probably both. The diet was abundant enough to sustain hard labour, limited enough to become tedious. There are specific foods that mark colonial New England as distinct from other places and times. Baked beans, for instance. Though the molasses-sweetened version associated with Boston develops later, beans were already a dietary staple, slow-cooked in pots, providing protein that stretched expensive meat further. Codfish, ubiquitous, appears in every form from fresh to salt-dried to turned into hash. Indian pudding, made from cornmeal and molasses, provides a sweet conclusion to meals on special occasions. Pumpkin, that New World vegetable, is boiled and mashed and baked into pies that will eventually become Thanksgiving tradition. And the alcohol consumption, we've touched on this before, but it bears repeating because modern minds find it so difficult to grasp. The average adult in colonial Boston consumes what would today be considered genuinely alarming quantities of alcoholic beverages. Estimates range from 3 to 7 pints daily, including beer, cider, and rum. This sounds like rampant alcoholism, until you factor in the low alcohol content of most daily drinking, the replacement of water, the cultural norms that treated moderate drinking as not merely acceptable, but healthy. The concept of temperance as a moral virtue barely exists yet. That movement comes later, in the 19th century. For now, drinking is simply what one does. Rum deserves special attention. By the early 1700s, Boston has developed a substantial rum distilling industry, turning Caribbean molasses into spirits that are consumed locally and exported throughout the Atlantic world. Rum is cheaper than imported wine or brandy, more potent than beer or cider, and it quickly becomes the spirit of choice for colonial Americans. It appears in that tavern flip, in toddies served on cold evenings, in the drams that punctuate working days. The colonial economy is entangled with rum production, and rum production is entangled with the slave trade that provides the Caribbean labour force, growing the sugar cane that produces the molasses. Every swallow carries this history, whether the drinker contemplates it or not. Supper is also a social occasion, a moment when the scattered activities of day resolve into family gathering. The household head says grace, a requirement so automatic that skipping it would invite shocked comment, and the meal proceeds in relative quiet. Children are expected to eat without excessive chatter, to wait until offered food rather than grabbing, to demonstrate the good manners that reflect on their parents' upbringing. Apprentices and servants eat at the same table as the family, but typically in silence, their subordinate status maintained even in the communal act of eating. The food itself carries class markers that everyone understands. Wheat bread is superior to rye or cornbread, and appearing on the table says something about the household's means. Fresh meat in winter suggests wealth. Salted meat suggests ordinariness. Imported spices, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, appear in wealthy kitchens but rarely in poor ones. Sugar, as opposed to molasses, indicates money to spare. Every meal is a statement, a communication to family members and any guests about where this household stands in the intricate hierarchy of colonial society. As supper ends, the table is cleared, the trenchers scraped of every remaining morsel and set aside for washing. The fire continues its work, now primarily for heat and light rather than cooking. The household settles into its evening routine, which consists primarily of sitting near the fire and waiting for bedtime. There is work that can be done by firelight, mending, knitting, the small handcrafts that occupy idle moments, but the aggressive labour of day has wound down. The body, exhausted from hours of physical effort, craves rest. Perhaps someone reads aloud from a book, probably religious in nature. Perhaps conversation meanders through the events of the day, the gossip heard at market, the news from other colonies brought by arriving ships. Perhaps silence prevails, the family simply coexisting in the shared space, each member lost in private thoughts while the fire pops and crackles its commentary. The evening is short, bedtimes come early when mornings come early, and soon the children are being sent upstairs, the candles extinguished one by one, the household contracting towards sleep. But the meal remains with you, a weight in your stomach, fuel for the night's rest and tomorrow's labour. You are neither hungry nor satisfied, neither delighted nor disappointed. You are simply fed, which is enough. In colonial Boston, enough is often the most one can reasonably expect. The child has been sick for 3 days now, and the fear in the house is palpable. Fever burns beneath skin that has turned an alarming shade of pink. Small spots have appeared, first on the face, then spreading downward, and everyone knows what this means, even if no one wants to say the word aloud. Smallpox. The word carries a terror that modern vaccination has mercifully erased from collective memory. But in colonial Boston, smallpox is death walking through the streets, and it visits with devastating regularity. You watch as the woman of the house tends to the sick child, applying poultices that probably do nothing, offering herbal teas that might ease symptoms but cannot touch the underlying disease, praying with an intensity that suggests she knows prayer may be the only genuine intervention available. There is no antibiotic, there is no antiviral, there is only the human body's ability to fight off infection, and in perhaps one case out of 4 or 5, that body loses the fight. Medical knowledge in colonial Boston exists in a strange twilight between folk wisdom and early science, between magical thinking and genuine empirical observation. Physicians, the few who exist, who have formal training, operate under humoral theory, the ancient Greek idea that the body contains 4 humors whose balance determines health. Disease represents imbalance, and treatment involves restoring equilibrium through bleeding, purging, blistering, and other interventions that frequently weaken already weakened patients. The bleeding in particular strikes modern observers as barbaric, but it persists because theory demands it, and because sometimes patients recover regardless of what is done to them. You watch the physician arrive, his black coat announcing his profession, his manner suggesting the authority that education confers. He examines the child, takes the pulse, considers the symptoms, and reaches his diagnosis, which everyone already knew, followed by his prescription. Bleeding. Of course. The lancet comes out, a small cut is made, blood flows into a waiting basin, and the child, already depleted, grows paler still. The theory holds that this removes corrupted blood, allows the body to generate fresh humours, restores balance. The practice, in the case of smallpox at least, probably does more harm than good. But the physician believes what he has been taught, and the family believes in physicians, and the ritual proceeds as it has proceeded in countless sick rooms before. There are alternative practitioners, women who have accumulated knowledge through years of caring for the sick, who understand which herbs reduce fever, which poultices draw infection, which teas ease the coughing that accompanies so many illnesses. These women are not physicians. They cannot call themselves physicians. They have no formal standing in the medical hierarchy. But they are often more effective than the university-trained men who bleed and purge and theorize. Folk medicine works sometimes precisely because it focuses on symptom relief rather than humoral intervention, because it has been refined through generations of observation, because women who spend their lives nursing the sick develop intuitions that book learning cannot provide. Childbirth falls entirely to these female practitioners, as we will explore later. But illness generally sees a mixture of approaches. The physician called when money and severity warrant, the neighbourhood healer consulted for lesser complaints, the mother's own knowledge applied to the routine fevers and injuries of childhood, and prayer, always prayer, woven through every other intervention. Medicine and religion are not separate spheres in colonial Boston. Healing comes from God, and human practitioners are merely instruments of divine will. If the child recovers, God has shown mercy. If the child dies, God has called another soul home. The outcomes are already written. Human efforts merely participate in a drama whose ending is predetermined. Smallpox is the great terror, but it is far from the only killer. Measles sweeps through populations with almost equal devastation. Diphtheria, called throat distemper in colonial parlance, strangles children with the membrane that grows across their airways. Dysentery, the bloody flux, kills through uncontrollable diarrhea, particularly in summer months when heat accelerates the spoilage that contaminates food and water. Typhoid, typhus, whooping cough, scarlet fever, the names recur in burial records with numbing frequency. And then there are the injuries that become infections, the infections that become deaths. A cut on the hand turns angry red, the redness spreads, fever follows, the limb swells, hot to the touch, shooting pain with every movement. There is no antibiotic to halt the bacterial invasion. There is only hope that the body can contain the infection, or amputation if it cannot. Amputation performed without anaesthesia beyond perhaps a stiff drink. The patient held down by strong men while the surgeon's saw grinds through bone. Some survive this, many do not. The shock alone kills a significant portion, and those who survive live diminished, their missing limbs constant reminders of how close death came. Historians still debate the overall mortality rates of colonial America. The numbers are imprecise based on fragmentary records and inconsistent reporting. But the general picture is clear. Death was everywhere, always, waiting around every corner. Infant mortality approached or exceeded 50% in some periods and places, half of all children born dying before adulthood. Adults who survive childhood might expect to reach 50 or 60 if lucky, but if lucky, carried enormous weight. A healthy adult could be dead within a week from a disease that appeared without warning. There is a quirky medical practice that emerges in Boston during this period, one that represents genuine progress despite the controversy it generates: inoculation against smallpox. The practice, introduced to Boston during the 1721 epidemic by Cotton Mather, after learning of it from an enslaved African man named Onesimus, involves deliberately infecting healthy people with material from smallpox pustules, giving them a mild case of the disease that confers immunity. It works. It dramatically reduces mortality rates among those inoculated. But it is also dangerous. Some people die from the inoculation itself, and it is controversial, with many considering it an impious interference with divine providence. The debate over inoculation splits colonial Boston, anticipating later controversies over vaccination, over public health measures, over the tension between individual liberty and collective protection. The child in the sick room continues to struggle. The fever peaks and breaks, following a pattern that the watchers cannot control and barely understand. The spots spread and eventually begin to crust, which is either a sign of recovery or a sign of nothing in particular. The household suspends normal activity, focusing collective attention on the small body in the bed, waiting for an outcome that will come when it comes. Someone must sit with the child at all hours, monitoring, soothing, praying. This task falls to the women, as caring tasks generally do. And if the child dies, as children so often die, there will be grief, but there will also be something like acceptance. Death is woven into the fabric of colonial life, so common that it cannot be treated as exceptional. The funeral will happen quickly, the body buried before decay advances. The surviving family will mourn according to prescribed rituals, will wear mourning clothes for prescribed periods, will eventually return to the routines of daily life because daily life does not pause for loss. Another child may be born, may bear the same name, may provide some measure of continuity that helps the family move forward. But tonight, the child still lives, and so hope persists. The woman by the bedside continues her vigil. The physician has departed, having done what he considers his duty. The house is quiet except for the crackling fire and the child's laboured breathing. Tomorrow will bring what tomorrow brings. For now there is only the watch and the prayer and the waiting. There is a man working on the dock alongside you whose skin is darker than yours, whose accent carries traces of places you have never been, and whose status in colonial Boston is something you have absorbed without ever needing to examine closely. He is enslaved. He belongs, legally, fully, in the eyes of the law, to a merchant whose warehouses line the wharf, and his labour enriches that merchant in ways that will never benefit himself. This is normal. This is unremarkable. This is the colonial world that you inhabit without question. The story of slavery in colonial Boston is often overlooked, overshadowed by the more dramatic plantation slavery of the South, but it is present nonetheless. By the early 1700s, Boston has a significant population of enslaved Africans, perhaps 1,000 people in a town of 12,000, working as domestic servants, as dock labourers, as assistants in workshops and counting houses. They are bought and sold in the same markets where other goods change hands. They appear in newspaper advertisements, offered alongside furniture and livestock, their skills and ages and physical conditions described with the clinical detachment of commodity trading. The man on the dock is named something that his owner chose for him. Classical names are popular, with enslaved people given the names of Roman emperors and Greek heroes in a kind of bitter irony that amuses their owners. His birth name, the name his mother gave him in a place across the ocean, is unknown to you and probably unknown to most of the people who interact with him daily. He has been stripped of identity as thoroughly as he has been stripped of freedom, remade as property in the New World. His work is the same work that other dock labourers perform: hauling, lifting, loading, the brute physical effort that keeps commerce moving. But his legal situation is entirely different. He has no wages, his labour belongs to his owner, who may hire him out to others but keeps whatever payment results. He has no legal recourse if mistreated, no path to advancement, no hope of working hard enough to improve his circumstances. He cannot marry without his owner's permission, and any children he fathers will be born into the same bondage, their status following their mothers in the cruel logic of hereditary slavery. And yet, within these brutal constraints, enslaved people in Boston create lives of meaning and resistance. They form communities centered on churches that welcome black worshippers, finding in Christianity a message of spiritual equality that their material circumstances deny. They develop skills that make them valuable, gaining small negotiating powers that somewhat mitigate their condition. Some are permitted to hire themselves out, keeping a portion of the wages while passing the rest to their owners, a system that creates modest economic autonomy and, for the fortunate, a path toward purchasing freedom. Free black Bostonians exist alongside the enslaved, their numbers small but their presence significant. Some have been manumitted by owners moved by conscience or convenience. Some have purchased their own freedom through years of accumulated labour. Some are the descendants of earlier generations of free people, navigating a society that treats them as perpetual outsiders, regardless of their legal status. They work as sailors, as artisans, as small traders, carving out precarious existences in a town that does not welcome them, but cannot entirely exclude them. The laws governing black life in colonial Boston reflect the anxieties of a society built on racial hierarchy. Curfews restrict when black people can appear in the streets. Regulations limit their ability to gather in groups, fearing the coordination that might lead to resistance. The testimony of black witnesses carries less weight in court. Marriage between black and white residents is prohibited. At every turn, the law reinforces distinctions that colony founders claimed were natural and inevitable. There is a particular hypocrisy that historians note with varying degrees of emphasis. Many of the same Bostonians who will, in a few decades, protest British tyranny and demand liberty are currently profiting from, or at least accepting without protest, the enslavement of fellow human beings. The rhetoric of freedom that will fuel revolution does not extend to those whose skin marks them as different. All men are created equal will be penned by slaveholders, and the contradiction will echo through American history for centuries. But you don't think about these things, not really. The enslaved man is simply part of the landscape, as natural and unremarkable as the barrels stacked on the wharf or the ships swaying at anchor. You, have been taught since childhood that African people are suited for bondage, that slavery exists because some races are naturally inferior, that the order you observe reflects a divine plan too vast for ordinary minds to question. These beliefs are not examined because they don't need to be examined. They are simply the water in which you swim, invisible because they are everywhere. The man finishes his task and moves to the next, his muscles rippling beneath a shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool air. His owner stands nearby, conferring with another merchant, paying no attention to the labour that makes his wealth possible. The transaction of exploitation is so routine that it requires no active supervision. The enslaved man knows what to do, does it, receives nothing in return but continued existence, and the system perpetuates itself without drama or crisis. There is a quirky detail that illuminates the texture of slavery in colonial Boston. Enslaved people sometimes appear in court, suing for their freedom on various grounds. The legal system, despite its fundamental commitment to racial hierarchy, occasionally produces outcomes that favour enslaved plaintiffs. A slave who can prove that he was illegally brought from a colony where slavery was less entrenched might win release. A slave whose owner's estate is mismanaged might find a sympathetic judge. These cases are exceptions, curiosities in a system designed to perpetuate bondage, but they suggest that the law's commitment to slavery was never quite absolute, never quite stable. The man on the dock does not dream of legal strategies. He dreams perhaps of home, a home he may barely remember, a place of warmth and family that grows more distant with each passing year. He dreams of freedom, surely, though he knows the odds against ever achieving it. He dreams of small pleasures, a meal with friends, a moment of rest, the rare occasions when his body is his own and he can do with it what he wishes. These dreams sustain him through days that would otherwise be unendurable, and you pass by, noticing him without truly seeing him, your own concerns filling your attention. You have work to do, wages to earn, your own struggles to navigate. The enslaved man's struggles are not your struggles. His life does not touch yours except in the most superficial ways, and so the system continues, unremarkable and unremarked, weaving itself into the daily fabric of colonial Boston, until it seems as natural and inevitable as the tides that wash against the wharf. Your passage to this place was paid for by years of your life, and the debt is not yet settled. You are an indentured servant, bound by contract to serve a master for a fixed term, typically 4 to 7 years, in exchange for the transatlantic crossing that brought you here. The ship that carried you was crowded, stinking, rocked by storms that made everyone on board pray for death or landfall, and now you're in Boston, which is better than the village in England or Ireland where you would have starved, but not by as much as you hoped. Indentured servitude is the engine that powers colonial labour. For every enslaved African working the docks, there are perhaps 2 or 3 indentured Europeans, their contracts owned by masters who control their time and their bodies for the duration of their terms. The arrangement seems, on paper, like a fair exchange. You offer labour, they offer passage and training and eventual freedom. In practice, the arrangement tilts heavily toward the masters, who extract maximum value from servants they will only possess temporarily. Your daily life is not dramatically different from an apprentice's, except that you are older, perhaps, and the skills you are learning are less specialised. You rise early, work until dark, eat what the household provides, sleep in whatever corner has been designated for servant use. Your master can discipline you physically for infractions real or imagined. Your master can extend your term of service if you misbehave, adding months or years to the time before you are free. Your master controls whether you marry, where you go, what you do with every moment that belongs technically to him. The work varies. You might be assigned to domestic labour, cleaning and cooking and tending children alongside the women of the house. You might be sent to the fields, if your master owns land outside the town, breaking your back to grow crops that will never be yours. You might work in a shop or a warehouse, learning the rhythms of commerce, your labour contributing to profits you will never share. The specific assignment matters less than the underlying reality. Your body is not your own, and it will not be your own for years yet to come. The line between indentured servitude and slavery blurs in ways that make historians uncomfortable. Servants can be sold, their contracts transferred from one master to another without their consent. Servants can be beaten within limits that are rarely enforced. Servants can be fed poorly, housed miserably, worked beyond reasonable endurance. And yet there is a line. However blurred, servants eventually become free. Their children are born free. The bondage is temporary, a season of suffering rather than a permanent condition. This distinction matters enormously to those who live it, even if it seems inadequate to modern observers. Runaways are common. Newspapers fill columns with advertisements seeking escaped servants, describing their clothing, their accents, their distinguishing marks, offering rewards for their return. A servant who successfully escapes can disappear into the anonymity of another colony, can assume a new identity, can live as a free person for however long the fiction holds. But capture means punishment. Additional years of service, public whipping, the humiliation of failed resistance. The risk is enormous. The temptation is constant. Women in indentured servitude face particular vulnerabilities. Sexual assault by masters or masters' sons is common enough that it appears in court records with depressing regularity. A servant woman who becomes pregnant faces extended service. She cannot fulfill her contract while caring for an infant, and the lost labour is added to her term. The child born of such assault might be bound out to service as well, the exploitation perpetuating across generations. Legal protections exist but are weakly enforced, the word of a master carrying far more weight than the word of a servant in any courtroom. There is an endpoint, and that endpoint sustains you through the years of labour. When your term expires, you become free. Your master owes you freedom dues, a modest stake meant to help you start independent life. Perhaps a sum of money, perhaps tools, perhaps a suit of clothes. Many masters attempt to avoid or minimise these payments, and many servants find themselves released into freedom with less than they were promised. But freedom itself is valuable beyond calculation. The right to work for yourself, to marry whom you choose, to move where opportunity beckons. After years of bondage, these rights seem almost miraculous. Former servants constitute a substantial portion of colonial Boston's working class. The blacksmith who shoes your horse may have spent his youth in indenture. The woman selling bread at market may have served 10 years before gaining her independence. The man who built your house may have arrived in chains of contract, his freedom purchased through years of forced labour. The economy runs on the accumulated work of bound labourers, and the economy rewards them only after their bonds have been discharged. Historians still argue whether indentured servitude should be understood as a form of slavery or as a different institution entirely. The similarities are striking. The loss of bodily autonomy, the legal ownership of labour, the vulnerability to physical punishment, the difficulty of escape. The differences are also striking. The fixed term, the legal personhood, the rights, however limited, that servants retained, the freedom that awaited at the end. Perhaps both perspectives are correct. Perhaps indentured servitude was its own thing, neither slavery nor free labour, but something in between, something that borrowed elements from both while remaining distinct. For now, you simply endure. The master's voice calls you to another task. Your body moves to comply, because compliance is the only viable strategy when resistance is punished and escape is risky. You count the days, though the counting grows tedious, the number's too large to hold in mind. Somewhere ahead lies freedom. Somewhere ahead lies a life that belongs to you, that somewhere sustains you through the present that does not. The crowd has gathered on the common, and you join them because everyone joins them, because public punishment is a spectacle that no one willingly misses. A man stands in the pillory, his head and hands locked through holes in the wooden frame, his posture forced into an uncomfortable stoop that will grow agonizing over the hours he must endure. Someone has already thrown something at him, a rotten vegetable perhaps, or worse, and the stain darkens his shirt. His crime has been announced. His shame is now public, visible to every resident of Boston who cares to witness it. Colonial punishment is designed for visibility. The goal is not merely to make the offender suffer, but to make that suffering instructive to everyone who observes it. Crime is a disruption of social order, and social order is restored through rituals that reaffirm community standards. You watch this man being humiliated, and you learn, or you're meant to learn, that his behaviour is unacceptable, that similar behaviour will bring similar consequences, that the community possesses the power and the will to enforce its expectations. The pillory is perhaps the most common public punishment, used for offences ranging from fraud to slander to disorderly conduct. The offender stands for hours, typically in a central location where foot traffic is heavy, exposed to whatever the crowd chooses to inflict. Verbal abuse is guaranteed. Physical assault is common. Rotten food, dead cats, stones when the crowd is angry enough. Occasionally someone loses an eye to a thrown object, and the authorities shrug because such injuries are understood as part of the punishment. If you commit a crime in colonial Boston, you accept not just legal sanction, but whatever violence your neighbours feel moved to deliver. The stocks serve a similar function, confining the offender's ankles rather than head and hands, forcing him to sit in public disgrace. Some are sentenced to hours, some to days, the exposure extending until the punishment seems sufficient. There is no privacy, no relief from the gaze of passers-by, no moment when the shame subsides. The town walks past on its daily business, and everyone sees the criminal, and the seeing is the point. More severe offences bring more severe responses. Whipping is common, stripped to the waist, tied to a post, and lashed with a multi-tailed whip that tears skin with each stroke. The number of lashes varies with the crime, from a dozen for minor infractions to dozens for serious ones. Blood runs down the back, the offender screams or holds stoic silence depending on temperament, and the crowd watches with what you might call entertainment or education or both. Public whipping is not hidden in a prison. It happens in the open, before everyone, its violence part of its message. Branding marks certain criminals permanently. A T burned into the hand or forehead indicates theft. A B indicates burglary. An A for adultery or F for forgery, or any of a dozen other letters that announce to everyone who sees them what crime this person committed forever. You cannot escape a brand. It follows you to every colony, every town, every interaction for the rest of your life. Employers see it. Potential spouses see it. Your children will ask what it means, and you will have to tell them that their parent is marked as a criminal. Hanging is reserved for the most serious offences: murder, certain repeat crimes, sometimes witchcraft in the era when such accusations still occasionally arise. The execution is public, of course, performed on the common before crowds that can number in the hundreds or thousands. A minister delivers a sermon, often extracting a confession from the condemned, turning the execution into a morality lesson for all who witness it. The body drops, the neck breaks, if the drop is sufficient, otherwise a slower strangulation ensues, and the crowd disperses with whatever moral improvement the spectacle was meant to provide. There is a peculiar logic to this public violence. Colonial Boston has no police force in the modern sense, no uniformed officers patrolling streets, no detectives investigating crimes. The Town Watch exists to cry the hours and report fires, but they are not law enforcement. Order depends on community surveillance, on neighbours watching neighbours, on the knowledge that misbehaviour will be noticed and reported, and public punishment reinforces this surveillance by making vivid the consequences of getting caught. You might escape detection, the system implicitly acknowledges, but if you are caught, this is what awaits. Women face some gender-specific punishments. Scolds, women whose speech has been deemed excessive, contentious, or disruptive, might be subjected to the ducking stool, a chair affixed to a long lever that plunges the offender repeatedly into cold water. The spectacle is meant to literally cool the hot temper that produced the offensive speech. Women accused of witchcraft, though less common in Boston proper than in the rural hinterlands, face trials whose outcomes can include execution. The courts that administer this justice are not concerned primarily with what we would call rights. There is no presumption of innocence, no right to counsel, no elaborate procedural protections. Confession is the gold standard of evidence, and various forms of pressure, not quite torture in the extreme sense but certainly coercion, can be applied to extract confessions. Witnesses testify, accusers accuse, and magistrates render judgment based on whatever evidence accumulates. Appeals are possible but limited. The process is designed for efficiency more than fairness. You watch the man in the pillory as another piece of refuse strikes him. His face is set in an expression that might be resignation, or humiliation, or carefully maintained blankness. He will stand there until the magistrates decide he has suffered enough, and then he will be released to walk home through streets where everyone knows what he did and how he was punished. The formal penalty ends. The informal social consequences may never end. This is justice in colonial Boston. It is not hidden behind prison walls. It is not delegated to professionals in uniforms. It is performed by the community, upon the community, for the instruction of the community. Its visibility is its point, and whether this system is more honest or more brutal than modern alternatives is a question without a clear answer, probably both, depending on how you weigh the values at stake. You turn from the spectacle, having seen enough, and continue about your day. But the image of the man in the pillory stays with you, as it is meant to stay, a reminder of what awaits those who transgress. The lesson has been delivered. Whether you have learned it depends on how well you internalize the fear. The young woman you are meeting tonight has been chosen, not quite for you, but with you in mind, by families who understand that marriage is far too important to leave to the vagaries of romantic feeling. Her father has spoken with your father, property has been discussed, expectations have been clarified, and now you are here, in her family's parlour, making awkward conversation while her mother watches from across the room, and your future is being decided in ways you only partially control. Courtship in colonial Boston is not what romance novels imagine. Love matters. Puritans actually valued affection in marriage, believed that partners should genuinely care for one another, but love is expected to develop after the practical arrangements have been settled. You do not marry because you have fallen passionately in love. You marry because the match makes sense, economically, socially, practically. Love can come later, growing from the shared life that marriage creates. Or it can fail to come, and you endure anyway, because divorce is almost impossible, and separation is scandalous. The woman across from you is evaluating you just as you evaluate her. She's assessing your prospects, what trade you practice, what property you might inherit, what kind of provider you're likely to become. You're assessing her domestic skills. Can she manage a household? Can she spin and weave and cook and keep accounts? Will she produce healthy children and raise them properly? Romance, in the modern sense, barely enters these calculations. This is a business arrangement between families, blessed by the church and regulated by the law, and the emotions of the two people at its centre are secondary concerns. Yet the parents hover because parents are supposed to hover. They have the authority to approve or reject matches, and their children are expected to defer. Marrying against parental wishes is possible. You're adults, after all, but it carries significant costs. Disinheritance is a real threat. Social disapproval can follow, and the practical support that families provide to newly married couples may be withheld if those couples have formed their union without proper consent. Wisdom dictates working within the system rather than against it. There is a practice called bundling that has entered American folklore, though historians debate how widespread it actually was. In bundling, courting couples are permitted to share a bed, clothed, under the watchful eyes of family members, sometimes with a wooden board placed between them to discourage too much contact. The practice supposedly allows young people to develop intimacy while remaining technically chaste, to talk through the night in the privacy that daytime encounters rarely permit. It sounds absurd to modern ears, but colonial courtship was conducted under constant supervision, and bundling may have offered one of the few opportunities for genuine private conversation. Whether bundling actually worked as advertised is another question. Premarital pregnancy rates suggest that colonial couples found ways around whatever barriers separated them, bundling boards included. Perhaps a third of colonial brides were already pregnant at their weddings, a statistic that indicates either widespread disobedience or widespread redefinition of what counted as acceptable behaviour. The community responded with measured disapproval, forced marriages if the father could be identified, public confession if necessary, and then absorption of the new family into ordinary social life. The sin was forgiven, more or less, once legitimacy had been established. Marriage itself was a civil ceremony in Puritan New England, not a religious one. The couple appeared before a magistrate, exchanged vows, and was pronounced married. There was no priest, no sacred ritual, no elaborate church wedding. The Puritans considered marriage a contract rather than a sacrament, important certainly, blessed by God, but not requiring religious officiation. This was actually a radical position, setting them apart from Anglican practice and ensuring that marriage remained under civil control. After marriage, the woman's legal identity essentially vanished. Under the doctrine of coverture, husband and wife became one person under the law, and that person was the husband. The property she brought to the marriage became his property. Her earnings, if she had any, were legally his. She could not sign contracts, could not sue or be sued in her own name, could not control her own economic life. She was, in legal terms, covered by her husband's identity, her existence subordinated to his. This sounds like a recipe for abuse, and sometimes it was. Husbands who beat their wives, who squandered family resources, who neglected their responsibilities faced limited accountability. The community might intervene in extreme cases. Neighbours who witnessed severe abuse might report it. Ministers might counsel troubled couples. But the legal tools for protecting women within marriage were weak. Divorce was theoretically possible for extreme causes: adultery, desertion, impotence, but practically rare. You married, and you stayed married, for better or worse. And yet many marriages were happy, or at least functional. Couples developed genuine affection through years of shared struggle. The partnership required by colonial household management created bonds of mutual dependence. Husbands and wives worked side by side, complementary parts of a single economic unit, and this collaboration could produce something resembling love even if it didn't start that way. The system was not designed for individual happiness, but individual happiness sometimes emerged despite the system. Widowhood offered women a peculiar freedom. When a husband died, his widow recovered some legal autonomy. She could own property, run businesses, make contracts. She became, in legal terms, a person again rather than an extension of another person. Many widows chose not to remarry precisely because remarriage would mean surrendering this hard-won independence. They managed taverns, ran shops, practiced trades, and navigated the world as economic agents in ways that married women could not. You and this young woman across the parlour will likely marry, assuming your families agree and assuming you find each other acceptable. You will build a life together, have children, grow old in each other's company if death doesn't intervene too early. You will come to know her better than you know anyone, and she will know you in return. Whether this knowing produces love or merely tolerance depends on factors neither of you can predict. But the decision approaches, the families wait, and the life you will lead is taking shape around choices being made in parlours like this one, practical and unsentimental and utterly ordinary. The room is crowded with women, their voices low, their hands busy with preparations you do not fully understand. A woman lies in the bed at the centre of this activity, her face tight with pain, her body working through contractions that come in waves. This is the lying-in chamber, the all-female space where colonial childbirth unfolds, and men are not welcome here. The mysteries of birth belong to women, to the midwife who presides, to the neighbours and relatives who attend, to the mother herself who must somehow survive what is about to happen. The midwife is an older woman, experienced, her skills accumulated through years of attending deliveries. She has no formal medical training. Medical schools do not admit women, and childbirth falls outside the male physician's domain anyway. Her knowledge comes from apprenticeship, from watching other midwives, from the accumulated wisdom passed down through generations of women who have brought children into the world. She knows which herbs ease labour pains, which positions help difficult deliveries progress, when to wait and when to intervene. Her hands have caught hundreds of babies, and she carries the confidence that experience provides. The labour has been going on for hours already, and no one knows how many more hours remain. There is no monitoring equipment, no fetal heart rate display, no way to assess the baby's condition except through the midwife's experienced touch. The mother endures because there is no alternative to endurance. She grips the hands of attending women, cries out when the pain becomes unbearable, rests in the brief intervals between contractions. Someone has prepared special foods, caudle, a warm spiced drink thought to strengthen labouring women, and someone else wipes her forehead with a cool cloth. The danger is real, and everyone knows it. Maternal mortality in colonial America is difficult to estimate precisely, but it is high. Perhaps 1 in every 50 or 100 births ends with the mother's death. Hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labour, eclampsia. The risks are numerous and unpredictable. The midwife can do many things, but she cannot do everything. If the baby presents wrong, if the labour fails to progress, if something goes catastrophically wrong, her options are limited. Sometimes she can intervene successfully, sometimes she cannot. And then the family that anticipated a joyful arrival instead holds a funeral. Infant mortality is equally grim. Perhaps 1 in 5 babies dies before their first birthday, claimed by the dozen ailments that tiny bodies cannot fight off. The births that proceed smoothly produce children who may or may not survive. The births that proceed badly produce children who often don't survive. and the mothers who have just endured hours of painful labour have no guarantee that the child they struggle to deliver will live to grow up. This uncertainty shapes every aspect of colonial attitudes toward children, toward family, toward the future that cannot be taken for granted. The lying-in period follows successful delivery. The mother remains confined to bed for days or weeks, recovering from childbirth in a darkened room, receiving visitors who bring food and help with household tasks. This is not merely custom, but necessity. Birth depletes the body, and recovery takes time. The neighbourhood women who attended the delivery continue to provide support, rotating through helping duties, ensuring that the new mother can focus on nursing her infant without worrying about cooking or cleaning or managing the household. It is a female community of care, surrounding vulnerable mothers with the labour that makes recovery possible, and there is churching, a religious ceremony marking the mother's return to public life after her confinement. She goes to the meeting house, gives thanks for surviving the ordeal, and is formally welcomed back into the community of worshippers. The ceremony acknowledges that childbirth is dangerous, that survival is not guaranteed, that gratitude for a safe delivery is appropriate. It also marks a transition from the private female world of the lying-in chamber back to the mixed public world of ordinary colonial life. Men remain peripheral to all of this. The husband waits outside the birthing room, pacing or praying or simply waiting, excluded from the process that will determine whether his wife and child survive. He may hear his wife's cries and be helpless to comfort her. He may learn that he is a father only when a woman emerges from the room to tell him. His role in reproduction is brief. The consequences of that role fall almost entirely on female bodies and female communities. The baby, if it survives, enters a world that greets it with mixed emotions. Joy, certainly. New life is always cause for celebration. But also caution, wariness, and unwillingness to invest too much hope in a creature so fragile. Colonial parents often did not name children immediately, waiting until the infant had proven its likely survival before bestowing the name that would mark its permanent place in the family. This delay speaks to hard experience. Too many names have been given to children who died before they could grow into them. The midwife finishes her work. The birth is complete, the mother is stable, the baby is breathing. Payment will be arranged later. Midwives work for fees that vary with the family's means. The attending women begin to disperse, returning to their own households and their own responsibilities, having provided the community support that makes colonial childbirth possible. And the mother, exhausted, begins the long process of recovery, knowing that this might be only the first of many births she will experience, that the cycle of pregnancy and delivery and nursing could continue for decades, that her body is now an instrument of familial reproduction that serves purposes beyond her individual comfort. This is how life begins in colonial Boston, in a darkened room surrounded by women, emerging into a world of uncertainty and danger, and sometimes survival. The baby will learn to walk, to talk, to work. It will absorb the values and expectations of colonial society, and if female, it may someday lie in its own bed, in its own lying-in chamber, bringing forth the next generation while women cluster around to help. The coffin is small, heartbreakingly small, and you carry it with others toward the churchyard where a fresh hole has been dug. Inside lies a child. Not your child, perhaps, but someone's child, someone's devastated loss, someone's contribution to the endless arithmetic of colonial mortality. This is not the first small funeral you have attended, it will not be the last. Death in colonial Boston is woven into life so thoroughly that the rituals of mourning have become as familiar as the rituals of birth. The funeral practices of colonial New England reflect a theology that sees death not as an ending but as a transition. The soul has departed for its eternal destination, heaven or hell, depending on whether God's grace was present, and the body that remains is merely a shell, important for proper burial but no longer inhabited by the person it once housed. The funeral is for the living, not the dead, an occasion for community gathering, for theological reflection, for the distribution of tokens that remind mourners of their own mortality, and tokens there are. Colonial funerals for families of means involve the distribution of mourning gifts, gloves, rings, scarves, sometimes given in numbers that seem absurd to modern sensibilities. A wealthy merchant's funeral might see hundreds of pairs of gloves distributed to attendees, the expense significant enough that some estates list funeral costs as a major category of probate. These gifts serve multiple functions. They honour the dead. They acknowledge the mourners. They provide physical reminders of the occasion that can be worn and displayed. Ministers accumulate such gifts over careers spent presiding at funerals, their wardrobes padded with the contributions of grateful families. The sermon is central, as sermons are central to everything in Puritan Boston. The minister speaks of the deceased, of their virtues, of the signs of grace that may have marked their salvation. But the sermon is also, perhaps primarily, about the mourners themselves, about the spiritual lessons the death provides, about the urgent need to prepare one's own soul for the departure that could come at any moment. Funerals are opportunities for evangelism, the dead serving as object lessons for the living. You stand in the churchyard and you think not just about the person in the coffin, but about yourself, about your own mortality, about whether you are ready to face judgment. Children's deaths are so common that they have generated their own category of mourning. Infant mortality rates fluctuate but often approach or exceed 20% in the first year of life. A family might bury 3 or 4 children before successfully raising one to adulthood. The grief is real. Colonial parents love their children just as modern parents do. But the expression of grief is shaped by its frequency. You learn to mourn quickly and resume daily life because daily life cannot pause for every loss. You learn to hold children at a slight emotional distance, protecting yourself against the probability of their deaths. Or so some historians argue. Others suggest that the intensity of grief was not diminished by its frequency, that each loss cut as deeply as the last. The burial follows quickly. Bodies decompose and the technology for preserving them does not exist. The coffin goes into the ground within days of death, sometimes within hours. The churchyard fills with graves, the stones marking name and dates and often a moralizing verse. Remember death, they warn, or, as I am now, so you shall be. The living pass among the dead regularly, the boundary between cemetery and town centre blurred in ways that modern zoning would never permit. Mourning attire marks the bereaved. Black clothes, worn for prescribed periods, signal to everyone that this person has recently suffered loss. Widows might wear black for years, the colour announcing their changed status as surely as any formal declaration. Children of deceased parents, siblings of deceased siblings, the gradations of mourning dress are complex, understood by everyone. A visual language of grief that speaks without requiring words, and then life continues. It must continue. The surviving children must be fed. The shop must be tended. The work that sustains the household does not pause for sorrow. Colonial life allows for mourning but cannot allow for paralysis. The rhythms of daily existence reassert themselves, the extraordinary crisis of death absorbed into the ordinary routines of living. You return from the graveyard to your spinning, your cooking, your trade, and you carry the loss with you while pretending that everything is normal. There is something both brutal and practical about this approach. Colonial Bostonians did not have the luxury of extended bereavement leave, of professional grief counselling, of the elaborate support structures that modern society sometimes provides. They had community, neighbours who helped, relatives who shared the burden, churches that promised eventual reunion with the departed. But they also had expectations of resilience, of carrying on, of not allowing grief to interfere too dramatically with the business of survival. The child in the small coffin is lowered into the ground. Prayers are said, earth is shovelled over the box, and then the mourners disperse, returning to homes and workshops, and the 1,000 tasks that await their attention. Another small stone will be carved, another name added to the churchyard's roll of the dead. And next month, or next week, or tomorrow, there will be another funeral, another loss, another reminder that life in colonial Boston is precarious and short and surrounded always by the certainty of death. The dame school meets in a front room of a house much like any other. The teacher a widow or married woman who supplements household income by gathering neighbourhood children and drilling them in their letters. You sit on a bench, slate in hand, and you copy the shapes that will eventually unlock the world of reading. A, B, C, scratched in chalk, erased, scratched again until the forms become familiar. This is education in colonial Boston, and its purpose is not what modern educational philosophy would recognise. Puritans valued literacy intensely, but their reasons were specific. The ability to read was essential because it provided direct access to scripture, to the Bible, to catechism, to the religious texts that nourished the soul and prepared it for salvation. An illiterate person was a spiritually vulnerable person, dependent on others to interpret God's word, unable to engage directly with the text that might save them from damnation. Satan, in Puritan theology, was called the deluder, a being who thrived on ignorance, who could mislead souls that lacked the ability to verify religious truth for themselves. Literacy was spiritual armour. The Dame School provides basic instruction: reading, rudimentary writing, perhaps simple arithmetic sufficient for household management. Girls are permitted, even expected, to achieve this level of literacy. They will need to read their Bibles, to keep household accounts, to function as the domestic managers that colonial marriage requires. But advanced education is not for girls. The Latin grammar schools that prepare boys for Harvard do not admit female students. The assumption is clear: women's roles are domestic, and domestic roles require only domestic learning. Boys from middling or wealthy families move from dame school to grammar school, where the curriculum intensifies dramatically. Latin is the core: Latin grammar, Latin composition, Latin texts from the classical authors. Greek may be added. The rote memorization is grueling, the expectations exacting, the punishment for failure swift and physical. The rod is the grammar school teacher's constant companion, applied for errors in recitation, for behavioural infractions, for the general purpose of driving knowledge into resistant young minds. The goal of grammar school is not broad education in the modern sense. It is preparation for college, specifically for Harvard, founded in 1636 to ensure that Puritan New England would have trained ministers for its churches. A grammar school graduate should be able to pass Harvard's entrance examinations, which test Latin proficiency above all else. From Harvard, graduates proceed to ministerial careers, or to other professional roles that require the classical learning the college provides. This is an elite track, available to a small fraction of colonial youth. For everyone else, education means whatever can be absorbed informally. Apprentices may receive basic literacy instruction from their masters, who are often contractually obligated to provide it. But the emphasis is on practical skills rather than book learning. You learn to read contracts, to keep accounts, to manage the paperwork that commerce requires. Beyond that, academic education is a luxury that working families cannot afford and do not particularly need. There is a quirky detail that illuminates colonial educational priorities. New England's literacy rates were substantially higher than those in the mother country or in the other colonies. The Puritan emphasis on direct scriptural engagement produced a population that could largely read. This had consequences the founders might not have anticipated. A literate population could also read political pamphlets, newspapers, the materials that would eventually fuel revolutionary agitation. The same literacy that was meant to protect souls from Satan's deceptions would, in time, help protect colonists from what they came to see as British tyranny. Women's education, though limited in formal scope, included extensive training in domestic skills. Girls learned to spin, to weave, to sew, to cook, to manage household economies. These were not frivolous accomplishments, but essential competencies that would determine whether a household prospered or struggled. A woman who could not spin thread, who could not make clothes, who could not preserve food and manage servants and keep accounts, was a woman unprepared for the responsibilities that colonial marriage would impose. The classroom, such as it is not quiet. Children recite aloud, practicing memory work, the room filled with competing voices chanting verses, spelling words, drilling the fundamental skills. There is no silent reading. Indeed, reading silently was considered strange, even suspicious. The normal mode was oral, the text transformed into speech. A literate colonial was someone who could read aloud fluently, not someone who could speed read through silent text. Books themselves were precious objects. A family might own a Bible, perhaps an almanac, perhaps one or two other volumes that have survived years of use. The printing press exists but is limited. Paper is expensive. Books are luxury goods. The Dame School likely has a horn book, a flat piece of wood with a paper lesson protected by a thin layer of transparent horn, that serves as the primary text for beginning readers. Its contents are minimal. The alphabet, perhaps a simple prayer, the bare essentials of literacy instruction. You trace the letters on your slate, repeating them until they become automatic. This is the foundation. On this foundation will rise whatever future awaits you, a future that may involve reading contracts or writing sermons, keeping accounts or studying scripture. The specific destination matters less than the starting point, and the starting point is here, in a room smelling of chalk dust and childhood, learning to make marks that will eventually carry meaning. The calendar in colonial Boston is sparse in ways that would strike modern observers as almost intolerably bleak. The celebrations, the holidays, the festive occasions that punctuate modern life, most of them do not exist here, and those that do exist carry complications that limit their joy. If you are looking forward to a Merry Christmas, you will be disappointed. Christmas, for much of colonial New England's history, was not merry. It was actually banned. The Puritans who founded Massachusetts Bay Colony held Christmas in deep suspicion. The holiday had no biblical basis. Nowhere in Scripture does it say to celebrate Christ's birth on December 25th, and its customs seemed to the Puritans to be pagan remnants dressed in Christian clothing. The feasting, the drinking, the general merriment, these were not spiritual practices but worldly indulgences that distracted from proper worship. Between 1659 and 1681, Massachusetts law actually prohibited Christmas celebrations, imposing fines on those caught observing the holiday. Even after the law was repealed, Christmas remained controversial, observed quietly if at all, not the public celebration it was becoming in other parts of the English-speaking world. What you do have is the Sabbath, which we have already explored, a weekly observance that is many things but not exactly festive. There are fast days, proclaimed by ministers and magistrates in response to threats or disasters, days of collective prayer and self-denial intended to secure divine favour or avert divine wrath. There are Thanksgiving days, similarly proclaimed, celebrating deliverances and blessings through worship and, somewhat more cheerfully, through communal meals. But these are irregular, scheduled in response to circumstances rather than fixed in the calendar. Thanksgiving in colonial Boston is not the November Thursday we know. It is an occasional observance, declared when something worth giving thanks for has occurred, a good harvest, a military victory, the end of an epidemic. The foods we associate with Thanksgiving, turkey, pumpkin pie, cranberry sauce, are eaten throughout the year, not reserved for a particular occasion. The ritualized family gathering, the football, the Black Friday shopping, these belong to a future that colonial Bostonians cannot imagine. Guy Fawkes Day, November 5th, actually generates genuine enthusiasm. This celebration commemorates the foiling of the gunpowder plot in 1605, when Catholic conspirators attempted to blow up Parliament. In England and its colonies, the day became an occasion for anti-Catholic expression. Effigies of the Pope burned, parades through streets, general revelry that combined patriotic celebration with sectarian hostility. In Boston, the day was observed with particular vigour. Rival gangs from different neighbourhoods competing to capture each other's effigies, the festivities sometimes descending into genuine violence. Election Day offers another occasion for celebration, though celebration here means something different from modern political parties. In Massachusetts, Election Day was the occasion when colonial leaders were chosen, and the day became a kind of fair, public speeches, military musters, markets selling food and goods, a general suspension of ordinary work. It was one of the few occasions when rural people travelled to Boston in numbers, swelling the population, filling the taverns, creating a festive atmosphere that contrasted with the solemn routine of ordinary weeks. Militia training days similarly provided breaks from routine. All able-bodied men were required to participate in periodic military training, and these gatherings combined serious drill with social functions. After the marching and shooting practice concluded, there was drinking, eating, fellowship. The gathering of men from scattered farms and shops into temporary community. It was not exactly a party, but it was not exactly not a party either. The seasonal rhythms of agriculture shaped celebrations in ways that formal calendars did not capture. Harvest time was busy, exhausting, but also triumphant, the culmination of a year's work, the filling of storage against winter hunger. Husking bees, where neighbours gathered to help process corn, combined work with sociability, the labour shared, the evening ending with food and perhaps dancing if the community's religious scruples permitted. These were not holidays in the formal sense, but they were breaks from isolation, occasions for connection. Weddings were celebrations, of course, though modest ones by modern standards. A civil ceremony, a meal, perhaps toasts. The elaborate productions we associate with modern weddings belong to future generations. Funerals, paradoxically, could also be celebratory occasions. The mourning mingled with social gathering, the distribution of gifts, the communal reaffirmation of bonds that death had disrupted. The absence of what we would call holidays had theological justification. Every day, the Puritans believed, should be devoted to God. Setting aside specific days as holier than others implied that other days were less holy, which seemed to diminish the constant presence of the divine. Better to maintain steady, consistent piety than to punctuate ordinary flatness with peaks of celebration that might invite excess. And yet human beings need celebration, need rhythm, need occasions that mark time's passage with something other than endless work. Colonial Bostonians found their celebrations where they could, in the seasonal cycles, in the irregular Thanksgivings, in the social gatherings that work itself sometimes permitted. The calendar was sparse, but life found ways to provide moments of joy despite the sparseness. The cry goes up at night, piercing through your sleep like a blade of sound. Fire! Fire! You're out of bed before you fully wake, your body responding to an alarm so fundamental that thought is unnecessary. Fire is the great terror of colonial Boston, the disaster that can turn an entire neighborhood to ash in hours, the one catastrophe against which all the prayers and preparations sometimes prove useless. And now it is here, somewhere in the darkness, glowing orange against the night sky. You rush into the street, joining the chaos of neighbors similarly roused, everyone moving toward the light while simultaneously wanting to flee from it. The houses in colonial Boston are made of wood. Wood frames, wood siding, wooden shingles, wooden everything, and they are packed close together, separated by alleys too narrow to serve as effective fire breaks. When one house catches fire, the houses beside it catch next, and the houses beside those, and the conflagration spreads faster than human efforts can contain it. The firefighting technology of the era is primitive by modern standards. There are no fire trucks, no hydrants, no pressurized hoses snaking water toward the flames. Instead, there are buckets, leather buckets, kept in homes specifically for this purpose, passed hand to hand in chains that stretch from the nearest water source to the fire itself. Citizens form bucket brigades, men and women and children alike, the leather handles wearing raw spots on palms as the buckets travel endlessly back and forth. It is exhausting work, it is dangerous work, and it is often futile work. The water arrives in such small quantities that it cannot match the flame's hunger. There are also fire hooks and axes, tools for pulling down buildings in the path of the fire, creating fire breaks through controlled destruction. This is a calculation of terrible arithmetic. If this house is torn down, perhaps the fire will stop here. If it is not torn down, the fire may consume everything. Property owners sometimes resist, unwilling to sacrifice their buildings to save their neighbours, and the resulting arguments can delay the demolition past the point of usefulness. Other times, buildings are pulled down that might have survived, the destruction premature or unnecessary. The decisions are made under pressure, in darkness, with incomplete information, and the outcomes are often suboptimal. Boston has burned before and will burn again. Major fires have swept through the town multiple times in its history, consuming dozens or hundreds of buildings, leaving families homeless, destroying the accumulated property of lifetimes. After each fire, rebuilding begins, often with resolutions to construct with brick or stone, to widen streets, to implement reforms that might prevent the next catastrophe. And then the resolutions fade, the wood rebuilding resumes, the density increases, and the conditions for the next fire are recreated. It is an almost cyclical pattern. Disaster, followed by reform, followed by forgetting, followed by disaster. The fire you have run toward is in a warehouse district near the waterfront. The buildings here store goods that feed the flames. Rope, canvas, tar, all the materials of maritime commerce, all of them combustible, some of them spectacularly so. The heat pushes you back, the air itself seems to be burning. You join a bucket brigade anyway, passing the heavy containers from hand to hand, knowing that you're probably too late, that this building at least is lost but unable to stand by and do nothing. The roar of a fire is something you do not forget. It sounds almost alive, a hungry creature consuming everything it touches, its voice a continuous rumbling punctuated by the crack of collapsing timbers. The light is strange, too bright, flickering, casting shadows that dance wildly, and the heat is physical, a pressure against your skin, a force that makes breathing difficult. People are screaming, shouting orders, calling for help. Someone has been injured, someone is being carried away. The chaos is total, and in the chaos, you simply work, passing buckets, because that is all you can do. By morning, the fire has burned itself out, Not because human efforts extinguished it, but because it ran out of fuel. A swath of the neighbourhood is simply gone, replaced by smoking rubble and the skeletal remains of chimneys that somehow survived. People pick through the debris, looking for anything salvageable, their faces blank with shock. Families that went to bed comfortable are now homeless, their possessions reduced to ash, their futures uncertain. Insurance, as a concept, is just beginning to develop in this era. Some property owners have policies, purchased from newly formed companies that are still learning how to calculate risk. Many have nothing, no safety net, no recovery fund, just the hope that community charity and personal resilience will somehow see them through. Rebuilding will begin soon, the sound of hammers replacing the sound of flames, new wood rising from the ashes of old, and in a few years the burned district will be rebuilt, and the threat of fire will seem distant, and the complacency that enables the next disaster will set in once more. You return home as the sun rises, your hands blistered, your clothes smelling of smoke, your body exhausted in ways that sleep alone cannot address. But your home is still standing, your family is safe. The fire took others, not you, and the relief mingles with guilt about feeling relieved. Tomorrow there will be work, and the day after that more work, and life will continue because life always continues. But tonight, you will check the hearth before sleeping, will make sure the fire is properly banked, will lie awake for a while thinking about flames. The fear never fully leaves. It simply waits, like the fire itself, for its next opportunity. The sun has set, and now comes the part of colonial life that modern people understand least, the darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, but actual physical darkness, the kind that swallows details, that makes familiar rooms feel strange, that forces a fundamental reordering of daily activity. You have perhaps an hour of usable twilight, then nothing but whatever light you can create yourself. And creating light is neither cheap nor simple. Candles are the primary source of artificial light for those who can afford them. They are made from tallow, animal fat, rendered and moulded around wicks, and they burn with a smoky, uneven flame that provides less illumination than you might imagine. The light is concentrated, local, casting a small circle of visibility while leaving the rest of the room in shadow. You position your work near the candle, angling your head to catch what light there is, and still you strain your eyes. Still the reading is difficult and the sewing imprecise. Beeswax candles exist and burn cleaner, brighter, longer. They are also expensive enough that ordinary households cannot afford them. Churches might have beeswax candles, wealthy families might have them, but for everyone else tallow is the reality. The smell of burning animal fat becomes as familiar as any other household odour, simply part of the olfactory landscape of evening hours. Rushlights offer a cheaper alternative, the dried pith of rushes dipped in fat and lit as simple wicks. They burn quickly, they provide minimal light, but they are essentially free to produce if you have access to rushes and a source of grease. Poor households make do with rushlights, their evenings even dimmer than those of their slightly wealthier neighbours, the margin between light and darkness even narrower. Firelight supplements these artificial sources. The hearth continues to burn through the evening, providing warmth and a certain amount of illumination. Activities move toward the fire, clustering in its radius, seeking both heat and visibility. The fireplace becomes the centre of evening life, the family gathered around it in a tableau that Norman Rockwell would later romanticise, though the reality is less cosy than paintings suggest. What do you do in the evening hours? Not much, by modern standards. The list of activities possible by firelight and candlelight is limited. Reading is difficult. The light is insufficient for sustained reading, and besides, books are scarce. Sewing can continue, hands guiding needle by feel as much as sight. Conversation happens, the family talking through the events of the day, sharing gossip and news, maintaining the bonds that community requires. Perhaps someone tells stories, or sings, or recites from memory. The tavern beckons for those with pennies to spend. The light there is better, more candles, larger fire, the accumulated illumination of a public space, and the company provides entertainment that home cannot match. But tavern evenings cost money, and money is not infinite, and many people simply remain home, sitting in the semi-darkness, waiting for tiredness to justify going to bed. Bedtime comes early because it must come early. When morning requires rising before dawn, evening cannot stretch too far. 9 o'clock is late, 10 o'clock is very late. Staying up until midnight seems almost decadent. The biological rhythms of colonial Boston sync with the sun in ways that modern electric light has completely disrupted. You sleep when it's dark because being awake when it's dark is expensive and largely pointless. The transition to bed is itself a ritual. The fire must be banked, covered with ash in a way that preserves coals for morning rekindling, while preventing the kind of overnight conflagration that could burn the house down. Candles must be extinguished carefully, completely. The house must be secured, doors latched, windows shuttered. There is no electricity to leave on, no porch light glowing through the night. When you extinguish the last flame, the darkness is absolute. You make your way to bed by memory, by the feel of walls and furniture, by the practiced navigation of a space you know intimately. Stairs creak under your weight. The bedroom is cold. The fire downstairs does not heat the upper floors effectively, and you dress for sleeping in layers, stockings and shift, perhaps a nightcap to retain head warmth. The bed is a refuge, the blankets piled high, and you burrow beneath them seeking the warmth that the house no longer provides. Sleep comes quickly to exhausted bodies. The dreams of colonial Bostonians are lost to history. We cannot know what they saw behind closed eyes, but the sleep itself was probably deeper, longer, more restorative than the fragmented rest that modern life often permits. Without alarm clocks, you woke when your body had rested enough, or when light began seeping through shutters, or when the sounds of the house told you that others were already stirring. There is something both limiting and liberating about this darkness. It forced colonial life into patterns that modern life has abandoned, evening activities compressed into the brief interval between supper and bed. But it also created a kind of intimacy. Families gathered around single sources of light, conversation undistracted by screens, presence fully present in ways that electric light and endless entertainment options have since eroded. And the stars on clear nights, the stars were visible as they no longer are to most modern eyes. Light pollution did not exist. The night sky blazed with points of light, the Milky Way clearly visible, the heavens displaying their ancient patterns without competition. Colonial Bostonians looked up and saw the cosmos that had accompanied humanity through all its history before electric light pushed it away. They navigated by stars, told time by stars, saw in that canopy something that we have largely lost. The woman across the lane is whispering to her neighbour, and you know, with the certainty that comes from living in a small crowded community, that she is whispering about you. This is colonial Boston, where privacy is impossible and reputation is everything, where everyone knows everyone else's business and where that knowledge can either protect you or destroy you. You straighten your shoulders and walk past as if you haven't noticed, because noticing would only provide more to whisper about. Gossip is the unofficial governance system of colonial towns. In the absence of police in communities too small for anonymity, social order depends on mutual surveillance. Your neighbours watch you, note your comings and goings, observe whether you attend church regularly, monitor whether you seem to be living within your means. Any deviation from acceptable behaviour is noted, discussed, passed from ear to ear until it reaches those with authority to act: ministers, magistrates, community elders. Gossip is not idle chatter. It is the transmission of social information that determines how the community responds to its members. Reputation, in this context, is almost a form of currency. A man with a good reputation can secure credit, find apprentices, attract customers to his business. A woman with a good reputation can marry well, be trusted with community responsibilities, receive help from neighbours in times of need. And these reputations are built slowly, carefully, through years of observable behaviour, through the accumulated testimony of everyone who has ever interacted with you. They can also be destroyed quickly. A single scandal, a single witnessed transgression, a single credible accusation. These can unravel the social capital that took a lifetime to build. The accused person may deny the charges, may marshal supporters, may fight back through the same gossip networks that spread the initial accusation. But damage, once done, is difficult to repair. People remember, people talk, the stain persists. Colonial courts sometimes handled cases that seem strange to modern eyes, cases of slander, where someone has accused another of crimes or moral failings without sufficient basis. These lawsuits were not trivial. They reflected genuine damage to reputations that translated into genuine material harm. A tradesman falsely accused of cheating his customers might lose business. A woman falsely accused of sexual impropriety might find herself unmarriageable. The words spoken in gossip had real-world consequences, and the legal system recognised this by providing mechanisms for redress. The surveillance was not entirely negative. Communities that watched each other closely also helped each other. A family struck by illness would receive food and care from neighbours who noticed the distress. A woman whose husband drank too much might find the community intervening, pressuring the husband to reform. The same networks that spread gossip also spread assistance, and the line between intrusive meddling and genuine support was often unclear. Women, particularly, served as nodes in these gossip networks. The daily activities of colonial women, visiting neighbours, gathering at wells and markets, helping at births and sickbeds, created constant opportunities for information exchange. The world of women's work was also a world of women's talk, and the talk covered everything: births, deaths, marriages, infidelities, business dealings, political opinions. The full range of human experience filtered through countless conversations. And there was the church, the institution that formalised the informal surveillance of daily life. Ministers heard confessions, received reports of misbehaviour, addressed misconduct from the pulpit. Church discipline could result in public shaming, in exclusion from communion, in formal excommunication for the most serious offences. The community of believers was a community of mutual accountability, watching over one another's souls with an intensity that could feel like care or like surveillance depending on one's perspective. Historians still argue about whether this system was more oppressive or protective. On one hand, the constant watching created enormous pressure to conform, limited individual expression, punished difference. On the other hand, the constant watching meant that people in trouble were noticed, that abuse was sometimes caught, that the vulnerable had some protection from the powerful. The same gossip that could destroy a reputation could also expose a fraud, protect a victim, bring wrongdoing to light. The whispering women have moved on now, their conversation having drifted to other topics or other targets. You continue about your day, aware that you have been discussed but uncertain what has been said. This uncertainty is itself part of the system. Not knowing exactly what others think of you, not knowing what stories circulate in your absence, forces a kind of performative propriety. You behave as if being watched, because you probably are being watched, and the watching shapes behaviour as surely as any written law. This is community, colonial style. It is suffocating and sustaining, restrictive and protective, a web of relationships that can feel like a trap or a safety net depending on the moment. You cannot escape it without leaving, and leaving means abandoning everything you know, starting over somewhere where your reputation does not precede you. For most people, most of the time, staying and conforming is easier than fleeing. And so the gossip continues, and the watching continues, and colonial Boston maintains its uneasy order through mechanisms that are nowhere written down but everywhere understood. There is anger in the streets tonight, an edge to conversations that did not exist a year ago, a tension that you feel in the way men gather at tavern tables and speak in low, urgent tones. Something is shifting in colonial Boston, something that does not yet have a name but that will eventually be called revolution. The seeds are being planted now, in the years before the famous events that history books will later celebrate, in the ordinary frustrations and grievances of ordinary colonists who are beginning to wonder whether the system that governs them serves their interests. The complaints begin with money, as complaints often do. The British government, having spent fortunes defending the colonies during the recent war with France, is looking for ways to recoup those expenses. Taxes are proposed, some implemented. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, a parade of revenue measures that strike colonial merchants as unfair impositions. The money extracted will flow to London, benefiting a distant government in which colonists have no representation. No taxation without representation is not yet the battle cry it will become, but the sentiment is taking shape. The merchants are the first to organise resistance. They have the most to lose, their profits directly threatened by duties and regulations that raise costs and complicate trade. They meet in counting houses and taverns, drafting petitions, coordinating boycotts, developing the networks of cooperation that will eventually become instruments of rebellion. Their opposition is initially economic rather than ideological. They do not yet dream of independence, only of relief from particular burdens. But economic grievances can evolve into political ones when the grievances go unaddressed. The crowds grow restless as well. Ordinary workers, sailors, artisans, people who may not fully understand the fine points of colonial trade policy, but who understand that something is wrong, that their lives are harder than they should be, that someone, somewhere, is to blame. When mobs gather to protest unpopular measures, these are the people who compose them. They throw rocks at customs officials, harass merchants who cooperate with Crown authority, provide the muscle behind the merchants' more cerebral resistance. There are meetings in the back rooms of taverns now, meetings where men speak words that would be treasonous if reported to the wrong ears. The idea of rights, natural rights, inherent rights, rights that no government can legitimately infringe, is taking hold. Colonial pamphleteers are articulating arguments that will eventually crystallize into revolutionary ideology, drawing on English legal traditions, on Enlightenment philosophy, on the particular circumstances of American experience. The intellectual foundations of rebellion are being laid, brick by careful brick. And yet most of colonial life continues as before. People work, marry, raise children, attend church, navigate the 1,000 ordinary concerns that make up human existence. The revolutionary ferment affects some people deeply and others barely at all. You might spend weeks without hearing a political conversation, months without noticing anything unusual. History, when it arrives, often arrives unevenly, touching some lives dramatically while leaving others essentially unchanged. The British government in London understands that something is happening in the colonies, but struggles to understand what, or why, or how to respond. The distance is immense. Messages take weeks to cross the Atlantic, and by the time London learns of colonial resistance, the situation has already evolved. Policy decisions made in Parliament reflect information that is already outdated, and the responses those decisions provoke arrive in London weeks after that. The lag time makes governance difficult and misunderstandings inevitable. There are loyalists, of course, colonists who remain committed to the British Crown, who believe that the protesters are dangerous radicals who benefit from or simply prefer the existing order. The revolutionary story America tells itself tends to minimize these people, but they existed in significant numbers, and the conflict that is coming will in some ways be a civil war as much as a war for independence. Neighbours will fight neighbours, families will divide, and the unity that revolutionary rhetoric proclaims will be more aspiration than reality. You feel the tension without fully understanding it. The words you overhear in taverns and streets are charged with an urgency you cannot quite explain. People seem angry, but people are often angry, and anger usually fades. This anger does not seem to be fading. It seems to be building, accumulating, seeking an outlet that has not yet been found. Something is going to happen. Something is going to change. But what, and when, and how dramatically? These questions have no answers yet. The revolution that is coming will transform everything: the political system, the economy, the very identity of the people who live on this continent. But from where you stand, in the years before the famous dates, you see only fragments. A pamphlet passed from hand to hand, a speech overheard in the market, a sense that the world is tilting towards something new. You do not know that you are living through the prologue to events that will echo for centuries. You know only that things feel different, that the old certainties no longer seem quite so certain, and that the future is more uncertain than it has ever been. The night watch calls the hour, his voice carrying through streets now mostly empty, his lantern a small point of light moving through the darkness. 11 o'clock, and all is well. The cry is traditional, formulaic, a verbal marker of time passing in a world without clocks visible from windows. You hear it from your bed, where you lie under heavy blankets, the day finally concluded, the endless labour finally paused. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, rising before dawn, dressing in the cold, eating humble breakfasts, navigating muddy streets, working until exhaustion. But tomorrow is not yet. Tonight, you rest. The bed beneath you is not comfortable by modern standards. The mattress is stuffed with straw or corn husks or feathers if you're fortunate, supported by ropes that creak and sag. You share this bed, probably, with a spouse, with siblings, with children, perhaps with all of them at once. The warmth of other bodies is a necessity, not an inconvenience, and the intimacy of sleeping together creates a physical closeness that modern private bedrooms have eliminated. You know the breathing patterns of your bedmates, their movements, their warmth against your side. The room is dark, truly dark, the kind of darkness that swallows everything, that turns familiar shapes into mysteries. Your eyes are open or closed. It makes little difference. The ceiling you cannot see is low, the walls you cannot see are close. A mouse scurries somewhere, its small sounds amplified by the silence. Outside, the wind pushes against the wooden shutters, and the house creaks in response, settling and shifting like a living thing. Your body aches. Colonial life is physical, demanding, a continuous cycle of effort that leaves muscles sore and joints stiff. The hands that worked all day are rough, calloused, marked by the particular labours they perform. The feet that walked miles of muddy streets throb with the accumulated fatigue. Sleep is not merely pleasant but necessary, the body's only opportunity to repair the damage that waking hours inflict. The sounds of the town filter through the darkness. A dog barks, then stops. Someone laughs in the distance, the sound cutting off abruptly. The night watch passes by again, his footsteps fading as he continues his rounds. This is the rhythm of colonial night. Not silent exactly, but quieter. The daytime bustle replaced by an incomplete stillness that allows sleep while reminding you that you're not alone. You think about tomorrow, about the tasks that await, about the small concerns that seem so large when you're trying to fall asleep. You think about the people you love, about the worries you carry, about the prayers you offered before climbing into bed. The world outside this room is vast and complicated, an ocean away. Events are unfolding that will eventually reshape everything. But from here, from the warmth of blankets, from the darkness of night, that vastness feels distant, almost theoretical. Life in colonial Boston is hard. We have walked through it together now, through the cold mornings and the smoky rooms, through the muddy streets and the crowded wharves, through the labour and the worship and the constant work. We have seen the children who died too young and the women who laboured without recognition. We have stood in taverns and in meeting houses, in lying-in chambers and on execution grounds. We have felt the weight of hierarchy and the chill of winter and the fear of flames in the night. And yet people lived here, generation after generation. They found joy in the midst of hardship, love in the midst of constraint, meaning in lives that seemed to us unimaginably difficult. They married and raised children and built businesses and argued politics. They told jokes and sang songs and hoped for better futures. The human capacity for adaptation, for resilience, for creating livable existence in even the harshest circumstances, this is perhaps the deepest lesson of colonial life. They made it work, they had to, and somehow, improbably, they did. The warmth is building beneath the blankets now, your body heat accumulated, the chill of the room kept at bay. Your breathing slows, deepens, begins the descent towards sleep. The house is quiet, the town is quiet. The world, for a few hours, will continue without you, and now it is time to let go, to let the weight of colonial Boston slip from your shoulders, to return from the past to whatever present you actually inhabit. The journey has been long, through centuries, through difficulties we can barely imagine, through lives that are lost to us except in these imagined reconstructions. But history is not just facts and dates. It is also feeling, atmosphere, the texture of daily experience that makes the past more than just a sequence of events. So close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. Let the images of the day fade, the muddy streets, the crowded wharves, the faces of people long since returned to dust. Let your body sink into whatever bed actually holds you, warm and safe in ways that colonial Bostonians could not always count on being. The night watch is calling the hour, somewhere in your imagination, his voice growing fainter as sleep approaches. 11 o'clock and all is well. 12 o'clock and deeper still. The town sleeps, and the century sleeps, and you sleep with them, held in the gentle darkness, drifting toward dreams that history cannot record. The fire is banked, the door is latched, the stars wheel overhead, the same stars that colonial eyes once watched, the same ancient light falling on different sleepers in different ages. Rest now, you have earned it. The journey through colonial Boston is complete, and the night belongs to silence and to peace. Sweet dreams until next time.